Hello, and welcome back to Historian at Midnight. On a stretch of coastline the old poets could never quite agree on the location of, some placing it far to the west beyond the setting sun, and others placing it somewhere along the northern edge of Libya, where the known world simply ran out. There is a cave mouth ringed with statues, and every single one of those statues was once a living thing that made the mistake of looking up at exactly the wrong moment. A ram stands frozen mid-stride near the entrance, one leg still lifted from a step it will never finish taking. A little farther in, a bird sits petrified on a stone that was once a branch, its wings still spread as though it meant to fly the instant before it forgot how. And deeper still, past ram and bird and the vague worn shapes of men who wandered in armed and confident and never wandered back out again, 3 winged women sleep together in the near dark, their bronze hands folded, their golden wings catching what little light reaches that far into the stone, and where an ordinary woman's hair would fall loose and dark across a pillow, theirs moves on its own, coiling and uncoiling in a slow, private rhythm, because it is not hair at all, but a nest of living serpents dreaming the same dream their sisters are dreaming. 2 of the 3 sleeping women in that cave will still be sleeping when the sun rises tomorrow, and the day after that, and every day for as long as the world itself continues turning, because immortality was written into them from the very first hour of their birth, and nothing born of mortal hands was ever going to be able to touch them. The 3rd will not see the sun rise even once more. A young man is already climbing toward that cave mouth as we begin tonight's story, moving with the particular deliberate quiet of someone who's been told, by more than one god, that the smallest mistake in the next few minutes will end with his own body added to the ram and the bird and the nameless men already standing frozen in that entrance, and he carries with him a shield polished to a mirror shine that he has been expressly forbidden to stop looking into, because the one thing that separates him from every stone figure around him is his own willingness never once to look at what he came here to kill directly with his own 2 eyes. Her name was Medusa, and by the time this story reaches its own ending tonight, she will be beheaded in her sleep by a stranger she never harmed. Her severed head will be carried across the length of the known world, doing exactly the same work of stonemaking it once did, while still attached to her own shoulders, and her face, endlessly reproduced on shields and temple walls and doorways for the next 3,000 years, will become one of the single most recognised images the whole of Greek mythology ever produced, recognised today by people who could not name a single other figure from the story we are about to tell. But we are not going to let ourselves rush toward that cave mouth, and that sleeping woman, and that waiting sword the way so many shorter, tidier retellings of this story always do, because the honest answer to the question sitting in tonight's own title, why was Medusa turned into a monster, turns out to depend entirely on which ancient poet you happen to be listening to, and those poets, separated from one another by centuries and by entire different ways of understanding what a monster even was, never actually agreed with each other at all. It looks like a good number of you listening tonight still haven't subscribed to this channel, and if that happens to be you, this is a good moment to fix that. Please take just a second to subscribe. It costs you nothing, and it genuinely helps us reach our very first 1,000 subscribers, a small goal, but one this little corner of the internet would love your help reaching. Now let us settle back in. This is a story about a face, the most famous monstrous face the ancient world ever produced, but it is also, underneath that face, a story about who gets to decide what counts as a monster in the first place, and about how easily that same word, monster, can be used to describe a genuine and irredeemable horror in one telling, and in another telling from a different century and a different poet's own pen, to describe a woman who did nothing at all except exist in the wrong temple on the wrong afternoon. We're going to take both of those tellings seriously tonight, the way we always try to take every side of a story seriously in this room, and we're going to let them sit uncomfortably next to each other, rather than smoothing them into one single comfortable answer, because the discomfort itself is the truest thing this whole story actually has to offer us. Let us say the thesis plainly, here at the very beginning, so you know the shape of the whole long night still ahead of you. Medusa was not, in the oldest surviving version of this story, ever a victim of any transformation at all, born instead exactly as monstrous as she died, one of 3 sister Gorgons whose family had never known any other shape. But roughly 700 years after that oldest version was first written down, a Roman poet, working in an entirely different language and an entirely different century, told an entirely different story, one in which Medusa began her life as one of the most beautiful mortal women the ancient world had ever produced, a priestess sworn to a virgin goddess's own temple, and was transformed into the monster. This whole tradition remembers her not as any punishment for a crime of her own making, but as the direct and lasting consequence of a god's assault upon her in a temple that was supposed to keep her safe. Tonight's story is going to walk through both of those tellings in full, honestly, and without pretending either one cancels the other out, because the real question underneath tonight's title was never simply what happened to Medusa. It is a much older and much harder question about who, across 3,000 years of retelling, this whole tradition has actually chosen to blame. It is worth naming too, before we let ourselves settle into the long, unhurried telling still ahead of us tonight, that this whole story is going to keep circling back to a single, simple image, a face that could not safely be looked at directly, and a hero who survived his own confrontation with that face only by refusing, at every single moment, to look at it honestly. It is worth carrying that image with you across everything still to come tonight. The mirror, the reflection, the deliberate, disciplined refusal to see something plainly for exactly what it is. Because this whole story, underneath its shields and its severed heads, is also quietly asking you, its own listener, to do the one thing its own hero never had to do at all. To look directly at Medusa herself, honestly and without flinching, and to decide for yourself, once and for all, exactly what you actually see there. So get comfortable, let your shoulders sink into the bed, settle in for a long and unhurried night, and let yourself ease into one of the strangest and most quietly contested stories the Greek world ever told, a story about a face that turned the living to stone, and about the much longer, much slower argument the ancient world kept having with itself over exactly how that face came to exist. Before there was a Medusa, there was a sea, and before there was a sea, there was chaos, the same yawning, formless gap this channel has already described in an earlier telling of Zeus's own long climb to kingship, out of which the very first true beings of the cosmos arose unbidden and unfathered. Out of that gap came Gaia, the earth herself, and it was Gaia, together with Pontus, the sea that rose directly out of her own body, without any other parent needed at all, who began a second and considerably stranger family line than the one that produced the Titans and eventually the Olympian gods. This channel has already spent so many nights following in this very room. It is worth pausing on the fact that Greek mythology, when it wanted to explain where its more unsettling creatures actually came from, almost never reached first for the golden, orderly lineage of Zeus and his own siblings, but instead for this older, stranger branch descended from the restless, unmapped sea itself, a lineage of monsters and guardians and half-glimpsed dangers that never sat comfortably at any council table on Olympus, and never particularly wanted to. From Pontus and Gaia came Nereus, the gentle and truthful old man of the sea whose own 50 daughters, the Nereids, would go on to populate countless later stories with their own quiet, watery grace, and Thaumas, whose name meant wonder, and Phorcys and Ceto, and it is these last two, Phorcys and Ceto, brother and sister married to one another in the same pattern of close-kept family unions, that produced nearly every early generation of gods this tradition ever described, who matter most to tonight's telling, because it was Phorcys and Ceto together who became the parents of an entire catalogue of the strangest and most fearsome beings the Greek imagination ever produced, a catalogue this whole tradition would go on drawing from for every hero story it ever told afterward. It is worth pausing briefly on Phorcys and Ceto themselves before we move on to their own children, because the old poets tell us remarkably little about either parent's own appearance or character, a silence worth noticing given how much attention this same tradition lavishes on so many of its other primordial figures, Ceto in particular remembered across later Greek usage less as any fully realised individual goddess, and more as a kind of walking shorthand for the sea's own vast, indifferent danger, her very name eventually giving later naturalists the root behind the modern scientific term cetacean, still used today to classify whales and dolphins. One more small piece of evidence that this entire family's own name has continued drifting quietly through modern vocabulary in directions almost no one who uses those words ever stops to trace back to their own origin. It is worth naming a few of that catalogue now, before we ever reach Medusa herself, because the family she was born into tells us a great deal about what this whole tradition expected of her from the very moment of her birth. There was Echidna, half beautiful woman and half serpent, who would go on to mother an entire further generation of monsters, the many-headed hound Orthus, the 100-headed dragon Ladon who guarded the golden apples of the Hesperides, and in some tellings, the Chimera and the Sphinx besides. There was Ladon himself in other genealogies, and there were the Grey, 3 sisters born already old, grey-haired from the very moment of their birth, sharing between the 3 of them a single eye and a single tooth that had to be passed from hand to hand whenever any one of them needed to see or to eat, a detail this story is going to return to at real length once Perseus himself finally enters tonight's telling. And there were the Gorgons, 3 sisters named Stheno, whose own name meant strength, Euryale, whose name meant far-roaming or wide-leaping, and Medusa, whose own name, unlike either of her sisters, meant something closer to guardian or ruler, the one who protects or the one who rules, a name this story is going to ask you to hold on to carefully across everything still to come tonight, because a creature named for guardianship is not, on the face of it, a creature this tradition originally imagined as a senseless horror waiting only to be destroyed. The old poet Hesiod, writing in his long poem The Theogony sometime around the 8th century before Christ, roughly the same period this channel has already named as the age of Homer's own great epics, tells us plainly that the 3 Gorgon sisters lived beyond the stream of Oceanus, the great river the old Greeks believed encircled the whole flat disk of the known world, near the Hesperides themselves, in a place close by the boundary of night, where their voices could be heard, but where no mortal traveller of ordinary courage ever actually went looking for them. It is worth pausing on what Hesiod actually tells us about these 3 sisters, because his own account, our very oldest surviving written source for this whole story, is considerably shorter and considerably less interested in explaining their origins than any modern listener, raised on centuries of later retelling, might expect. Hesiod does not tell us that Medusa was ever beautiful. He does not tell us she was ever anything other than exactly what she was when Perseus finally found her, and it is worth sitting honestly with how strange that absence actually is, because it means the single most famous detail modern audiences carry into this story. The idea that Medusa was punished, transformed from something lovely into something terrible, is entirely missing from the very oldest telling we possess. In Hesiod's own account, 2 of the 3 sisters, Stheno and Euryale, were immortal and ageless from the moment of their birth, exactly as befit daughters of a primordial sea god and his own primordial wife, while Medusa alone, for reasons Hesiod never once explains or seems to think require any explanation at all, was born mortal, doomed from her very first breath to die in a way her sisters never could. A mortality settled into her family the same way a birthmark might be, arbitrary, unchosen, and entirely beyond her own power to alter, a queen among monsters, and a fate her sisters never shared. It is worth pausing here, before we go any further, on the sheer strangeness of a mortal being born into an otherwise entirely immortal family. because this story is going to ask that single fact to carry an enormous amount of weight across everything still ahead of us tonight. Two sisters who would live forever, untouched by time or by any mortal blade, and one sister sharing every other feature of her family's own monstrous inheritance. The bronze hands, the golden wings, the tusks. Some tellings gave her in place of ordinary teeth, and above all the serpents that grew from her own scalp in place of hair, but marked, unlike either Stheno or Euryale, with the single certainty that someone would eventually be able to kill her. It is worth pausing too on what that mortality actually meant for the shape of the rest of this story, because it is the plain, mechanical reason Medusa alone, of all three Gorgon sisters, is the one whose name survived into the modern world at all. A hero going hunting for an immortal target has no story to tell afterward. A hero going hunting for the one mortal creature hidden inside an immortal family has, for the very first time, something worth the journey. It is worth pausing honestly on why the old poets never actually bothered explaining that single, load-bearing detail, because Hesiod simply states it as an existing fact of the world, the way he states that Oceanus encircles the earth, or that Tartarus lies 9 days full beneath it, offering no origin story at all for why two sisters born of the exact same parents, in the exact same union, should receive such radically different inheritances. It is worth naming, though, that this particular pattern, one mortal child set apart from an otherwise immortal family, is not actually unique to Medusa within the wider tradition, because this channel's own listeners have already heard, in the story of Zeus, of the god's own decision to let Thetis marry a mortal man specifically, so that any child she bore would be mortal rather than divine, a mortality assigned there quite deliberately, as a safeguard against prophecy, rather than as any accident of birth. Medusa's own mortality carries no such explanation anywhere in the surviving record, and it is worth sitting with that absence for a moment, because it means her single most consequential trait, the one fact that made her killable at all, and therefore made this entire story possible in the first place, was simply handed to her at birth with no reason ever given, an arbitrary inheritance she did not choose and could not have refused, not unlike, in its own way, the arbitrary punishment Ovid would go on to hand her, many centuries later, two separate unearned burdens laid on the exact same set of shoulders by two entirely different tellings that never otherwise agreed on anything at all. It is worth naming too exactly what the old poets tell us this face and this body actually looked like, because the image modern audiences carry, a beautiful woman's face crowned only with snakes, is itself already a considerable softening of what the earliest Greek imagination actually pictured. Archaic vase painters and the earlier sculptors who depicted the Gorgon, working in the centuries immediately following Hesiod's own lifetime, gave her a face that was frightening rather than beautiful by any ordinary measure, a broad, grimacing mouth often fitted with boar's tusks or a protruding tongue, a face closer in spirit to the ferocious, wide-eyed masks later cultures would carve above doorways specifically to frighten away evil, than to anything resembling a wronged and lovely woman. It is worth pausing on that image for a moment, because it means the version of Medusa most listeners carry into tonight's story, tragic and beautiful even in her monstrousness, is actually a considerably later softening of a figure the earliest Greek imagination pictured as something closer to pure, undiluted terror given a face, a being meant to be looked at only long enough to be recognised and then never looked at again. It is worth pausing too on the actual physical pose these earliest artists so consistently gave her whenever they painted or carved her whole body rather than her face alone, because it is a detail modern retellings almost never think to include, and it changes the whole picture considerably. Archaic Greek art had a standard convention. Art historians today call it by the German term Niellauf, literally kneeling run, for depicting rapid motion. A figure shown with both legs bent as though caught mid-stride, arms often outstretched, and it was in exactly this pose, running or perhaps fleeing rather than standing still to menace anyone, that the Gorgon was painted again and again across the surviving pottery of the 7th and 6th centuries before Christ. A specific vase painter active in Athens during this same period, whose own individual style was distinctive enough that modern scholars, unable to recover his actual name, simply call him the Gorgon painter, having identified his own particular hand behind an entire surviving cluster of vases built around exactly this image, wide-mouthed, tusked, tongue extended, legs caught forever in that same bent running stride. It is worth sitting with the strangeness of that specific pose for a moment, because a monster caught running, rather than one standing coiled and waiting to strike, is a considerably stranger and considerably more ambiguous image than the stationary, waiting predator later centuries would come to imagine her as, and it is worth wondering, honestly, whether that earliest generation of Greek artists actually understood her, even then, as something closer to fleeing than to hunting. A detail this telling cannot resolve any more definitively than the poets themselves ever did, but one worth carrying forward regardless. It is worth pausing, too, on exactly where a great many of these earliest Gorgon images were actually meant to be seen, because the answer is considerably more solemn than an ordinary household shelf or an ordinary drinking party might suggest. A great many surviving examples of this same archaic Gorgon imagery come down to us not from temples or from private homes at all, but from grave sites, painted onto the large ceramic vessels ancient Greek families used to mark and to honour their own dead, and it is worth pausing on why a grieving family would choose, of all possible images, a monstrous snarling face to stand watch over a loved one's own resting place. Because the answer this tradition seems to have settled on was precisely the same logic, driving every other use of this same image. This telling has already described tonight, a horror set to guard against a further horror, deployed here specifically to frighten away whatever unseen dangers the ancient world believed might otherwise threaten a grave and the vulnerable, newly departed soul resting inside it. It is worth sitting with that particular use for a moment, because it means an ordinary grieving Greek family, standing at a fresh grave sometime in the 7th or 6th century before Christ, likely understood Medusa's own face not primarily as a villain's face at all, but as one of the most trusted guardians available to them, the exact same instinct in the end that would eventually place her on Athena's own shield, on temple pediments, on roof tiles, and on the coins jingling in an ordinary citizen's own pocket, an entire civilization reaching again and again for one single wronged and monstrous face whenever it needed something to stand between itself and the dark. We spoke, a moment ago, of the grey, and it is worth pausing on them now before Perseus himself finally enters tonight's telling, because their own strange existence tells us something true about how this whole family of seaborne monsters actually lived. 3 sisters, Enyo, Pefredo, and Dano, in most of the tellings that bother to name them individually at all, born already old, their hair grey from their very first hour of life, sharing between the 3 of them a single eye and a single tooth, passing each one hand to hand whenever sight or a meal was needed, a detail that sounds, on first hearing, almost comic. 3 ancient sisters fumbling an eyeball between them in the near dark, until you actually sit with what that image really means. 3 beings who can never all see the world at the exact same moment, who must trust each other completely and constantly, simply to move through their own lives at all, permanently, physically bound to one another by the plain mechanical fact of their own shared and limited senses, in a way no other family in the whole of Greek mythology quite matches. It is worth pausing before we move any further into this family's own particular strangeness, on how thoroughly this same pattern, monstrous and strange beings imagined overwhelmingly, though never quite exclusively in female form, actually runs through the whole of Greek mythology's wider catalogue of dangers, because Medusa and her own 2 sisters were never the only such figures this tradition produced, and it is worth naming a few of the others now, because the company she keeps tells us something about what the ancient imagination actually expected a monster to look like. There were the sirens, whose own beautiful, irresistible singing lured passing sailors to wreck their ships against the rocks surrounding their island, a danger built, exactly as Medusa's own danger was built, around a single sense, hearing rather than sight, that could not simply be willed shut once the danger had already been noticed. There was the Sphinx, who guarded the road into Thebes with a riddle rather than with any blade at all, devouring every traveller who failed to answer it correctly. Her own body a composite of woman and lion and eagle's wings that this tradition clearly wanted its audience to find unsettling specifically, because none of her separate parts belong together in any single recognisable creature. There was Scylla transformed, in several later tellings of her own story, from a beautiful nymph into a many-headed horror ringed with barking dogs at her own waist, guarding a narrow strait alongside the whirlpool Charybdis, a transformation this telling is going to ask you to hold in your mind for a moment, because it echoes, in its own separate corner of this tradition, almost exactly the same shape Ovid gave to Medusa's own story. A woman's body made monstrous not through any fault of her own, but through the jealous anger of a more powerful goddess. And there was Echidna herself, we may recall from earlier tonight, Medusa's own first cousin by way of Phorcys, and Ceto's wider family, half beautiful woman and half serpent, mother to an entire further generation of this tradition's most fearsome creatures. It is worth pausing too on one further figure belonging to this exact same catalogue, because her own story maps onto Medusa's more closely than any of the others this telling has already named tonight. There was Lamia, a queen this wider tradition remembered as once having been loved by Zeus himself, and who lost, in the most painful tellings of her own story, every child that same union produced, devoured by Hera's own jealous cruelty, in a grief this telling suspects would sound by now uncomfortably familiar to anyone who has listened carefully to this whole night's telling, and who was transformed afterward by that same unbearable and unanswered grief into a monstrous, child-devouring creature herself, condemned to spend the whole of her own remaining existence enacting, against other mothers' children, the exact same horror that had first been done to her own. It is worth sitting with how closely that shape echoes everything this telling has already described about Medusa's own transformation. A woman handed an injury she never asked for and never deserved, and remembered afterward by nearly everyone who told her story in the centuries that followed, only for the monstrous shape her own unanswered grief eventually took. It is worth pausing on why this pattern exists at all, because it would be dishonest to pretend this whole tradition arrived at it by pure accident. Scholars who study this period of Greek storytelling have long noticed that danger, when this tradition wanted it to feel genuinely disorienting rather than simply large or strong, was disproportionately given a woman's face or a woman's voice, monsters that lured rather than charged, that riddled rather than roared, that punished beauty into horror rather than simply being born horrible and staying that way. And it is worth sitting, honestly, with what that pattern might actually be telling us about the fears of the culture that produced it, a world governed, in nearly every one of its actual households and actual city assemblies, by men, populating its own darkest imaginative corners with women's voices and women's faces made suddenly, unpredictably dangerous, as though the ordinary vulnerability men expected from women in daily life could always, in the right story, curdle without warning into something that could kill you. It is worth naming too that this pattern is not unique to Greece by any means, and that a great many other ancient traditions built their own catalogues of danger along broadly similar lines, but it is worth pausing here regardless, because Medusa's own story, whichever version of it you find truest, sits at the very centre of this exact pattern. A woman turned dangerous, whether by birth or by injury, and remembered for 3,000 years afterward almost entirely for the danger rather than for anything else she might once have been. A father who scattered violence out over the sea, and a family that grew from it. It is worth pausing, before we leave this whole family behind and turn at last to the young man who is going to end Medusa's life, on the deeper thread connecting this entire lineage back to the very oldest story this channel has ever told in this room, because it is not, in fact, a coincidence that a family this strange and this monstrous traces its own origin back to the sea. We spoke, in the telling of Zeus's own rise to kingship, of the moment Cronus cut away his own father Uranus's manhood and flung it out over the water, and of how the blood that fell from that violence gave rise to the Erinyes and to the giants, and of how the sea foam gathering around the severed flesh itself eventually produced Aphrodite, born of violence and salt water rather than any ordinary birth at all. Phorcys and Ceto's own monstrous children were never directly said, by any ancient source, to share that same specific origin, but it is worth sitting with the deeper pattern regardless, because this whole tradition seems to have understood the sea itself as a place where violence and strangeness naturally pooled and bred. A vast, unmapped, ungoverned expanse standing entirely outside the ordered councils of Olympus. And it should not surprise us, by the time we actually reach Medusa's own story tonight, that the violence she suffers is going to come, once again, from that same restless and ungovernable sea. That violence, and the god responsible for it, is where an entirely different Medusa story begins, one that Hesiod never tells us, and that no source we possess mentions for another several hundred years after his own lifetime, and it is worth pausing before we tell that second version in full on exactly how much time actually separates these two competing accounts, because the gap is considerably larger than most retellings ever bother to admit. Hesiod wrote his Theogony sometime around the 8th century before Christ. The poet who gives us the story most modern listeners actually associate with Medusa's name, a Roman writer working in Latin rather than Greek, composed his own version of these events sometime around the very turn of the 1st century after Christ, a gap of well over 700 years, longer than the entire span separating our own century from the founding of most of the oldest surviving universities in the Western world, and it is worth carrying that gap with you into everything still to come tonight, because it means the story most people actually know, the story we are about to tell in full, was not the ancient world's original understanding of Medusa at all, but a considerably later reimagining, arriving so long after Hesiod's own brief mention that an ordinary Greek listener hearing the two stories side by side might reasonably have wondered whether they were even describing the same figure. That later poet's name was Ovid, and the work in which this second Medusa story survives was a vast, sprawling poem called the Metamorphoses, composed in the final years before the birth of Christ and the earliest years just after it, a poem built, from its very first line to its very last, around a single unifying idea, that the whole of the world as the Romans of Ovid's own day understood it had been shaped, again and again, by moments of transformation, gods becoming animals, mortals becoming trees or rivers or stars, one shape endlessly folding into another across the whole, long history of the cosmos. It is worth pausing on that framing before we tell the story itself, because it means Ovid was never simply recording an old Greek myth exactly as he had received it. He was selecting and shaping, and, in more than one documented case across the whole of his enormous poem, very likely inventing entire episodes wholesale to fit his own larger argument about a world defined by constant, often painful change, and it is worth holding that possibility honestly in your mind as we tell what he actually wrote, because we cannot know, and no scholar now living can know with any real certainty, whether Ovid was preserving some older Greek tradition that simply failed to survive in any earlier text we still possess, or whether he was doing something closer to what a novelist does today, building a wholly new and deeply moving story out of only the barest inherited fragments of an older one. It is worth pausing too on the particular place inside his own enormous poem where Ovid actually chose to set this story, because he did not simply tell it on its own, in isolation, the way this telling has largely presented it tonight, but folded it into the middle of Perseus's own larger adventure, placed as a story told out loud at a wedding feast by Perseus himself, answering a guest who had asked him in the middle of the celebration, exactly how Medusa's hair had come to be made of serpents in the first place. It is worth sitting with that framing for a moment, because it means the whole story of the assault and the transformation in Ovid's own original telling was never actually narrated by Medusa or from anywhere close to her own perspective at all, but delivered second-hand at a party by the very man who had gone on to kill her. An irony this telling does not believe Ovid included by simple accident, because it is entirely characteristic of his own poem's much larger and much more consistent interest in exactly whose voice gets to tell a story of transformation, and whose voice, across the whole of that same enormous poem, gets left silent while someone else decides how their own body's changing is going to be explained to a room full of strangers enjoying themselves at dinner. Ovid tells us that Medusa was once renowned across the whole of the ancient world for a single feature above every other: her hair, thick and lustrous and more beautiful, by every account of every suitor who ever saw it, than any other woman's hair in the whole of Greece, and it is worth pausing on that detail before anything else, because it is the single cruelest piece of dramatic irony this entire story ever produces, the exact feature that made her famous for her beauty becoming, by the story's own ending, the exact feature that would make her famous for her horror instead. The same crown of hair transformed from the thing every suitor in the ancient world most wanted to touch, into the thing no living creature could ever look at again and survive. Ovid tells us that Medusa served, in the years before her transformation, as a priestess in the temple of Athena, the virgin goddess of wisdom and strategic warfare this channel has already followed across an entire earlier telling, a role that carried, in the actual religious life of the ancient Greek world, real and serious obligations of chastity and consecration, a priestess of a virgin goddess understood by everyone in her own community to belong, in a very real sense, to that goddess alone, her body and her devotion set apart from the ordinary business of marriage and desire that governed nearly every other woman's life in the ancient world. It is worth pausing for a moment on what that temple itself would actually have looked and felt like to anyone standing inside it, because Ovid's own audience would have pictured, hearing this story, a space built and maintained with real and careful devotion, cool stone underfoot even in the height of a Mediterranean summer, the low, steady scent of whatever incense or burnt offering had most recently been laid on the goddess's own altar, still hanging faintly in the air, a hush inside those walls that had nothing to do with emptiness and everything to do with reverence, the particular weighted quiet of a space an entire community had agreed, by long and unbroken custom, to treat as safer and more protected than any ordinary room outside it. It is worth sitting with that atmosphere for a moment before the violence that follows, because it means the temple's own sanctity was never incidental to this story at all, but the entire reason its violation carried the specific religious weight it did, a space built, brick by brick and generation by generation, around the explicit promise of safety, broken in the one instant that promise was supposed to matter most. It was into that temple, sacred and set apart, that Poseidon, god of the sea and the very same restless, ungovernable force this whole family of monsters had already been traced back to, came looking for Medusa, and it is worth naming plainly, without softening it in the telling the way so many shorter modern retellings unfortunately still do, exactly what Ovid says happened next. Poseidon assaulted Medusa inside that same temple, inside the one space in the whole of the ancient world that should have offered her the most protection, rather than the least, and it is worth pausing on the specific cruelty of that location, because the ancient Greek world held a deep and genuinely serious belief in the sanctity of consecrated ground, a belief that violence committed inside a temple carried a particular kind of pollution, a ritual defilement the Greeks called miasma, that stained not merely the immediate victims of that violence, but the temple itself and everyone connected to it, and it is worth sitting with the fact that Poseidon, a god whose own power and whose own place among the 12 Olympians this whole tradition never once seriously questions, chose to commit the violence in exactly the one location where its consequences would fall hardest not on himself, who faced no punishment at all for what he had done, but on the goddess whose sacred space he had defiled, and on the mortal woman he had defiled it with. It is worth pausing, honestly and at some length, on what happened next, because it is the single hardest turn in this entire story to sit with, and this whole tradition, across every century that has retold it since, has never fully agreed on how to explain it. Athena, discovering what had happened inside her own temple, did not turn her anger toward Poseidon, a fellow Olympian whose own standing and whose own considerable power made him, by the plain political arithmetic of Olympus, a far more dangerous target for any lasting punishment than the mortal woman who had just survived his assault. She turned it instead toward Medusa herself, transforming the very hair that had once been her single, most celebrated feature into a writhing crown of living serpents, and marking her, from that moment forward, with a gaze so terrible that any living creature who looked directly into her eyes would turn immediately and permanently to stone. It is worth pausing, too, on the honest range of explanations later readers, and even some ancient commentators, have offered for why Athena would do this, because the old sources themselves never actually settle the question, and it would be dishonest of this telling to pretend they did. Some ancient and many later readers have understood Athena's action as a punishment falling, however unjustly, on the pollution itself rather than on any judgment of Medusa's own moral guilt, an ancient world's literal, almost mechanical understanding of ritual defilement in which the miasma had to be answered somehow, and answering it by transforming the polluted party, however innocent that party actually was may have felt, to an ancient audience raised inside that same belief system, less like a moral verdict against Medusa specifically, and more like the closing of a wound that could not otherwise be closed at all. Other readers, ancient and modern alike, have understood it far more darkly, as a genuine act of misdirected jealousy or anger that a goddess with no earthly consequence to fear for striking at Poseidon directly chose instead to strike at the far safer and far more available target standing in front of her. And a great many modern readers, encountering this story for the first time without the ancient world's own particular framework of ritual pollution already built into their thinking, have understood it simply and starkly as one of the clearest surviving ancient depictions of a victim being blamed and punished for violence that was never her own fault at all. A reading this telling is not going to pretend is a modern imposition foreign to the story's own bones, because Ovid's own Latin, even read on its own terms and in its own century, gives us no indication that Medusa did anything at all to invite what happened to her. No seduction, no willing consent, no fault of any kind the poem itself ever names. It is worth pausing before we move any further on grounding this same concept of ritual pollution a little more concretely, because miasma was never a vague or merely poetic idea to the ancient Greek audiences who actually grew up believing in it, but a real and practically consequential part of ordinary religious life, governing everything from who was permitted to enter a temple after a death in their own family, to how a whole city was expected to respond once it discovered that some hidden crime had gone unpunished within its own walls. This channel's own listeners may already recognise this same concept at work in an entirely different and considerably more famous story, the tragedy of a king named Oedipus, ruling over a city called Thebes, that this channel may well tell in full on some other night, in which an entire city is struck by plague and famine specifically because a terrible crime, committed unknowingly by its own king, has gone unrecognised and unaddressed. The miasma of that hidden crime settling over the whole of the city like a physical poisonous fog until the specific pollution responsible is finally identified and answered. It is worth holding that same logic up against what happens to Medusa, because it means an ancient audience was primed, by the whole of their own religious upbringing, to understand that violence committed inside a sacred space demanded some kind of ritual answer, full stop, in a way that had very little to do with assigning moral blame to any one specific party the way a modern court of law might. That framework does not make Athena's own choice of target any less painful to sit with from where we stand today, and this telling is not asking you to feel any less discomfort about it than you already do. But it is worth understanding honestly that an ancient listener was not necessarily hearing a story about a goddess unfairly blaming an innocent victim. In the same terms a modern audience instinctively reaches for so much as a story about an ancient and largely impersonal mechanism of pollution and purification finding, as it so often did across this entire tradition, its cruelest and most convenient outlet in whichever party happened to have the least power to resist it. It is worth pausing on one further detail Ovid gives us before we let this particular strand of the story rest, because it is worth carrying forward into everything still ahead of us tonight. Ovid tells us that Athena, in some later tellings of this same episode, went on to place the transformed Medusa's own image, once Perseus had finally taken her head, at the very centre of her own shield, and it is worth sitting with the strange, uncomfortable symmetry of that final detail. A goddess who first transformed a wronged woman into a monster, later choosing to wear that same woman's face, forever, as her own personal emblem of protection. A symmetry this telling is not going to try to resolve into any tidy moral lesson, because the ancient sources themselves never resolve it either, and it may be one of the truest things this whole story has to tell us that even the goddess responsible for Medusa's transformation could not, in the end, stop carrying her face around for the rest of both of their existences. Are both hands accounting held open before we move any further into tonight's telling? It is worth pausing before we let ourselves drift too far from these two competing tellings and back into the more familiar business of quests and monsters and heroes to hold both of them up together side by side exactly as heavy as each other. Because this whole tradition, across every story it has ever told in this room, has always insisted on this same discipline, refusing the comfort of a single tidy answer, when the actual ancient record offers us two honestly competing ones instead. In Hesiod's telling, our oldest surviving source, Medusa was never a victim of any transformation at all, born monstrous exactly as her monstrous parents were, a Gorgon among Gorgons from her very first breath, and there is no cruelty in that telling to reckon with beyond the plane, arbitrary cruelty of a mortal lifespan handed to her and not to her two sisters. In Ovid's telling, composed centuries later in an entirely different language for an entirely different audience, Medusa was a wronged mortal woman, assaulted inside the one place that should have kept her safest and punished for that assault by the very goddess whose temple it happened inside, transformed into the monster. This whole tradition remembers her as through no fault or choice of her own at all. It is worth naming, honestly, that we cannot know which of these two tellings, if either, represents anything close to what an ordinary ancient Greek audience actually believed about Medusa in the centuries before Ovid ever picked up his own pen, because the 700 years separating Hesiod from Ovid are not empty of other sources, but none of the other sources that survive from those centuries, the vase paintings, the temple carvings, the scattered references in tragedy and lyric poetry. This telling is going to name in full a little later tonight, ever actually tell us Ovid's specific story of beauty and assault and transformation, which means it is entirely possible, and worth sitting with honestly, that Ovid was not recording a story the wider Greek world had told for centuries before him at all, but composing, largely out of his own considerable imagination, the version of Medusa that would go on, across the 2,000 years since, to become far more widely known and far more emotionally resonant than the older, sparer, telling it eventually eclipsed. It is worth noticing, too, that this is not actually such a strange thing for a single influential retelling to accomplish, because this whole channel has already shown you, across other nights in this very room, how thoroughly a single later poet's own choices can come to feel, centuries afterward, like the story's own original and inevitable shape. And Medusa's transformation from monstrous by birth to monstrous by injustice may be one of the clearest examples this entire tradition ever produced of exactly that process. It is worth pausing on this whole tension a little longer, because it does something this story is going to need us to understand clearly before anything else that follows can make its proper sense. Whichever telling an ancient listener happened to have grown up with, and whichever one you yourself listening tonight find more emotionally true, The young man now climbing toward that cave mouth we described at the very start of tonight's story does not know or particularly care which version of Medusa's origin is the correct one. He has been sent to bring back her head, regardless of how she came to deserve, or not deserve, the fate that is about to find her, and it is worth carrying that discomfort forward into the rest of tonight's telling, because it means the story we're about to follow, a hero's quest complete with magical gifts and monstrous obstacles and a triumphant return, is also, underneath all of that adventure, the story of a killing whose own moral weight this tradition never actually lets either its ancient or its modern audience settle comfortably. A cave at the edge of everything, ringed by the proof of every mistake that ever reached it. Let us return now to the actual geography of the place Medusa and her two sisters called home, because the old poets are careful to place it somewhere genuinely at the edge of the known and mapped world. A choice this story wants us to notice was never accidental. Some tellings place the Gorgons on an island called Sarpedon, off the coast of Libya. In the far distant reaches of the world, the ancient Greeks associated with everything strange and unmapped and dangerous that lay beyond their own familiar coastlines. Others place them, as Hesiod himself does, beyond the stream of Oceanus entirely, in the same twilight region near the Hesperides and near night herself, where so many of this tradition's strangest and most fearsome beings were said to make their homes, a region that functioned, across the whole of Greek mythology, less like an actual place any real traveller might stumble across by accident, and more like a kind of narrative pressure valve, a location the old poets could reach for whenever a story needed, somewhere far enough outside the ordinary governed world for something genuinely monstrous to live undisturbed. It is worth pausing for a moment on a single imagined figure standing among those frozen ranks, not because any ancient source ever names him specifically, but because it is worth letting at least one of them become briefly real in your own mind before this story moves past them entirely. Picture, if you will, an ordinary young man from some small and unremarkable village along the Greek coast, the kind of place this whole tradition rarely bothers naming at all, who had grown up hearing travelling merchants describe a hoard of treasure said to lie somewhere near a cave at the very edge of the world, guarded by three sisters whose danger, by the time the story reached his own village, had already been softened and exaggerated in roughly equal measure by however many mouths it had passed through on the way. Picture him setting out with his own father's sword and his own mother's blessing, certain, in the particular and universal confidence of youth, that whatever misfortune had befallen every other traveller who tried this same journey before him would somehow not apply to his own case, and picture the single, unremarkable moment, no different in his own mind from any other step of that same climb, when he finally rounded the last turn in that path and looked up. It is worth pausing before we describe that landscape, on why this whole tradition gave Medusa serpents for hair specifically, rather than any of the countless other frightening features it could just as easily have reached for, because snakes carried a very particular and very loaded set of meanings across the whole of ancient Greek religious imagination, meanings this story was almost certainly drawing on, deliberately rather than by any simple accident of imagery. Serpents, across this entire tradition, were consistently associated with the chthonic, the world of the earth, and the dead lying beneath the ordinary sunlit world of gods and mortals alike, a connection this channel's own listeners have already encountered once before, in the story of Zeus, in the great serpent Python that once guarded the oracle at Delphi before the god Apollo arrived to claim that same sacred ground for himself, a monster this tradition remembered as older than the Olympian order itself, tied to the earth's own deepest and most ancient authority, rather than to the newer, brighter authority of the sky. Athena herself, worth naming here because of how directly it bears on everything this telling has already described about her own complicated relationship to Medusa, was consistently depicted across ancient art carrying a snake of her own, coiled beside her shield or wound around her own spear, a detail scholars connect to her own guardianship of the city of Athens, and to the Earth's own old pre-Olympian authority, that her own newer cult had, in some sense, absorbed and repurposed rather than simply replaced. Even the god of healing this telling has already named tonight Asclepius, carried a single serpent wound around his own staff, an image so enduring that it survives today as one of the most widely recognised symbols in the whole of modern medicine, and it is worth sitting with the fact that a single animal could carry, within this one culture's own imagination, both an image of healing and an image of pure horror at the exact same time, because it means the snakes crowning Medusa's own head were never simply an arbitrary mark of ugliness this tradition chose at random, but a very deliberate reach into some of the oldest, deepest, and most ambivalent religious imagery the Greek world possessed. Older authority and hidden danger are woven together into a single writhing crown that no one who saw it could ever mistake for anything else. It is worth pausing on the landscape this whole tradition imagined surrounding that cave, because later poets, elaborating on Hesiod's own spare account across the centuries that followed him, filled it with a detail that has become one of the single most visually striking images this entire story ever produced. A field of statues ringing the cave mouth itself, every one of them a living creature caught in the exact instant it made the fatal mistake of looking directly at Medusa's own face. Some tellings describe animals among these statues, birds frozen mid-flight, and beasts frozen mid-stride, exactly as we imagined at the very opening of tonight's story, while others describe men specifically, armed travellers and would-be heroes who had heard of the Gorgons' treasure, or simply of their fame, and had come looking for a glory that turned, the instant they laid eyes on what they were hunting, into an eternity of silent, unbreathing stone. It is worth pausing on what that field of statues actually tells us about how this whole tradition wanted its audience to understand Medusa before Perseus himself ever arrives in the story, because it means she was never, even in the versions least sympathetic to her, imagined as a monster who went looking for victims. Every single statue in that field belonged once to someone who came looking for her, and it is worth sitting with that detail for a moment, because it reframes the entire coming confrontation before it has even properly begun, not as a hero rescuing the world from a predator actively stalking it, but as one more traveller arriving uninvited at the edge of the world, hunting a creature whose only crime, in the most literal reading this story allows, was continuing to exist exactly where she had always lived. It is worth pausing too on the fact that not one of those stone men left behind a name any surviving source ever bothered to record, because it is worth remembering, here at this early point in tonight's telling, a habit this channel has already leaned on across other nights in this room, that the old poets almost never counted their own dead with any real care, content instead to gesture, in a single passing phrase, toward an entire field of ruined lives and move on immediately to the one traveller whose own story actually mattered to them. Every single one of those statues was, before it was ever a statue, a full and complicated human life. A son who had a mother waiting somewhere for news that would never arrive. A young man who had told his own friends the night before he set out exactly how he intended to make his fortune and his name. An older, more careful traveller who had perhaps heard the stories and come anyway, driven by debt or by desperation or by nothing more complicated than an ordinary human hunger for a glory that was never actually his to claim. None of them received a burial. None of them received a single line of mourning from anyone this tradition thought worth quoting. They simply stand there still, in every telling of this story that bothers to mention them at all, an anonymous, uncounted crowd of failed ambitions frozen at the exact threshold of a home they were never going to reach. And it is worth carrying that uncounted crowd with you into the rest of tonight's story, because it means the field surrounding Medusa's own cave was never simply scenery. It was a graveyard that had never once been treated as one. Let us leave that cave and that field of frozen statues for a while, and travel instead to an entirely different corner of the Greek world, because before we can understand why Perseus himself ever set out on this particular hunt at all, we need to understand the far stranger and far more tangled chain of prophecy and fear that put him on that road in the first place, a chain that, once you actually trace it back to its own beginning, turns out to share more in common with the family habits. This channel has already spent an entire earlier night describing in the story of Zeus than most listeners coming to Medusa's story for the first time would ever expect. In the city of Argos, in the years before any of tonight's actual story begins, there ruled a king named Acrisius, and Acrisius, like so many fathers and grandfathers, this whole tradition has already shown us across other stories, went to an oracle one day seeking an answer to a question he almost certainly wished, by the time he actually received it, that he had never asked at all. The oracle told Acrisius that he would have no sons of his own, but that his daughter, a young woman named Danae, would one day bear a son, and that this grandson, once grown, was destined to kill him. It is worth pausing on how immediately and how completely this single prophecy echoes everything tonight's earlier sections have already described about Uranus fearing Cronus, and Cronus fearing Zeus, a father, or in this case a grandfather, hearing a warning about his own eventual destruction at the hands of his own blood, and choosing exactly as every frightened patriarch in this whole tradition eventually chooses to answer that fear not with any attempt at reconciliation or acceptance, but with an act of confinement meant to make the prophecy physically impossible to fulfill. It is worth sitting with that echo a little longer than usual, because it means Medusa's own eventual killer was himself, born directly out of the exact same family habit this channel has already spent an entire earlier night describing. A father figure so frightened of his own eventual replacement that he was willing to imprison an innocent child rather than risk it. And it is worth noticing, with a certain grim and quiet irony, that Perseus, the one hero in tonight's own story who managed to survive that same old habit and grow to manhood despite it, went on to become, in his own turn, the exact instrument of violence that ended an entirely different and entirely unrelated woman's own life at the edge of the world, as though this whole tradition simply could not tell a story about power and fear without that same violence eventually finding its way out and landing sooner or later on somebody who never actually deserved it. Acrisius, unwilling either to kill his own daughter outright or to simply wait and see whether the oracle's warning might yet prove false, had Danae shut away instead, in most tellings inside an underground chamber built entirely of bronze, sealed so completely against any ordinary form of entry that no mortal man, Acrisius believed, could ever possibly reach her. It is worth naming what happened next, because it is one of the single strangest and most visually memorable images this whole broader tradition of Greek mythology ever produced, and because it connects Medusa's own eventual killer directly back to the very king of the gods this channel has already spent an entire earlier night following. Zeus, whose own wandering desire we have already described at real length in the story of his own rise to kingship, saw Danae shut away in her bronze chamber, and desired her regardless, and rather than approaching her in any of the more familiar disguises this channel has already named, a swan, a bull, a shower of white feathers, he came to her instead as a shower of pure golden light, pouring down through whatever narrow opening the bronze chamber allowed, filling the room with a warm liquid brightness that Danae herself, by every telling this story preserves, experienced not as violence but as something closer to a strange and overwhelming visitation, and it was from that union that Danae conceived a son. That son was named Perseus, and it is worth pausing before we follow him any further on the particular cruelty of what Acrisius chose to do once he discovered that his own daughter had, against every precaution he had taken, born a child regardless. He did not believe Danae's own account of a god's visitation, or did not care whether he believed it, and rather than risk killing his own daughter and her infant son outright, an act this tradition consistently treats as carrying its own separate and dangerous religious pollution, Acrisius chose instead a method this whole story has already shown us in a slightly different form once before tonight, sealing mother and newborn child together inside a wooden chest, and setting that chest adrift on the open sea, trusting the water itself to finish what his own hand was unwilling to do directly. Exactly the kind of distanced, deniable violence this whole tradition seems to understand its frightened patriarchs, reaching for again and again whenever the guilt of a more direct killing feels like more than they can personally bear. The chest drifted for some time across open water, carrying a terrified young mother and an infant son neither of them had any real hope of surviving, until it finally washed ashore on the small island of Seriphos, where a fisherman named Dictys, casting his own net into the sea that morning expecting nothing more than an ordinary catch, drew up instead a wooden chest containing 2 living human beings, and it is worth pausing on the plain, unglamorous kindness of what Dictys did next, because this whole story is going to need us to remember it later, taking the exhausted, frightened Danae and her infant son into his own home and raising the boy in the years that followed, not as any recognised Prince of Argos, but as an ordinary fisherman's own adopted charge. A childhood built entirely out of the kind of quiet, unremarkable decency this tradition so rarely bothers to give its own heroes credit for. It is worth pausing, before we follow Perseus into his own boyhood on that island, on what those same years must have actually felt like from his own mother's side of the story, because this tradition, exactly as this channel has already noted was true of Rhea's own grief in the story of Zeus, rarely bothers to linger on a mother's interior life for any longer than the plot strictly requires it to. Danae had survived an underground prison and an open sea inside a sealed wooden chest, had watched her own infant son sleep through a journey that could easily have drowned them both, and had arrived, against every reasonable expectation, on a small and unfamiliar island with nothing to her own name beyond the clothes she had been sealed away in, and the child she'd somehow managed to keep alive. It is worth imagining, honestly, what those first months on Seriphos must have actually been like for her. A young woman raising a god's own son inside a simple fisherman's household, watching him grow, year by year, into exactly the kind of strength and exactly the kind of confidence that had once terrified her own father, enough to seal her away from the world entirely. And it is worth wondering whether she ever once let herself imagine, watching her son at play on that same shoreline, that the very prophecy her own father had tried so hard to drown might still, one day, somehow find its way back to both of them, regardless of how far the sea had already carried them from Argos. It is worth naming, too, exactly what kind of island Seriphos actually was, and exactly who ruled it, because the next turn in this story depends entirely on the particular character of the king Perseus grew up under. Dictys had a brother, a king named Polydectes, who ruled over the whole of Seriphos, and it is worth pausing on the contrast between these two brothers, because this whole story is going to ask us to hold them up against each other the same way it has already asked us to hold Cronus and Zeus up against each other in an earlier telling, one brother offering shelter and honest kindness without any expectation of return, and the other, as Perseus grew from an infant into a young man of real strength and real confidence, watching that same growth with an entirely different and considerably less generous set of eyes. Polydectes, over the years Perseus spent growing to manhood under Dictys' own roof, came to desire Danae for his own wife, and it is worth pausing on why that desire on its own might not have posed any particular problem at all, except for the single, considerable obstacle standing directly in Polydectes' way. A grown son, strong and fiercely protective of his own mother, entirely unwilling to stand aside and watch her married against her own wishes to a king neither of them particularly trusted. Polydectes, understanding perfectly well that Perseus himself was the one genuine obstacle between his own desire and its fulfillment, devised a scheme to remove that obstacle without ever having to risk an open confrontation. He had no particular confidence he would win, and it is worth pausing on the particular cleverness and the particular cruelty of the scheme he actually settled on. Polydectes announced, to the whole of his own court, that he intended to marry an entirely different woman, a princess named Hippodamia, and requested, according to the ordinary customs of the time, that every man attending his own court contribute a gift befitting the occasion, horses in most tellings, a fitting tribute from men of real means and real standing, and it is worth pausing on the scene itself for a moment. A great hall filled with the island's own assembled nobility, each man rising in turn to name whatever fine animal or whatever gleaming piece of worked metal he intended to bring. the whole gathering following an old and familiar rhythm of status, quietly measured and quietly compared, gift against gift, house against house, in exactly the kind of public arithmetic every ambitious court in the ancient world understood without ever needing to say so aloud. Perseus, young and proud and stung, in more than one telling of this story, by an unspoken accusation that he had nothing of real value to offer at all, made a rash and sweeping promise in front of the entire assembled court, declaring that he would bring Polydectes any gift the king cared to name, however impossible. And it is worth pausing on how completely and how immediately Polydectes seized on exactly the opening he had been waiting for, naming, without a moment's hesitation, the single gift he was entirely confident no young man in the whole of the known world could ever actually deliver: the head of the Gorgon Medusa. It is worth pausing on the particular cruelty of that request, because Polydectes had every reason to believe he had just sent Perseus to a certain death. A young man with no divine equipment and no particular battle experience being asked, in front of an entire court, to travel to the very edge of the known world and return with the severed head of a creature whose gaze alone had already turned countless armed and experienced men to stone before Perseus had even set out. It is worth sitting for a moment with how thin the line actually was, in this particular moment, between Perseus's own genuine courage and Polydectes' own calculated cruelty, because the very same rash promise that would go on, across the whole rest of tonight's story, to be remembered as the origin of one of Greek mythology's most celebrated quests, began as nothing more noble than a trap, set by a king who wanted a young rival gone, and who was fairly confident when he set it, that he would never have to look at that rival's face again, a goddess and a messenger, and the equipment no mortal hand could have assembled alone. Perseus, setting out from Seriphos with a promise he had no earthly means of fulfilling, and no clear idea of where the Gorgons even lived, might well have simply died somewhere on the road. One more overconfident young man added to the field of statues we described at the very start of tonight's story. Had two gods not taken a direct and personal interest in his own particular quest? Athena, the same goddess this whole story has already shown us in her far more troubling role in Ovid's own telling of Medusa's transformation, appeared to Perseus, and it is worth pausing on the genuine strangeness of that appearance. A goddess who, in one entire strand of this story's own tradition, bears direct responsibility for what Medusa actually is, now choosing to personally guide the young man who is about to end that same transformed woman's life. A strangeness this telling is not going to smooth away, because it may be one of the truest and most uncomfortable threads running underneath this entire night story, that Athena's own involvement in Medusa's death cannot be separated, however this tradition wants to frame it, from her own earlier involvement in Medusa's original transformation. Hermes, the clever messenger god, this channel has already shown you playing a quieter, similarly essential role in the recovery of Zeus's own stolen strength during the war against the monster Typhon, joined Athena in guiding and equipping Perseus for the task ahead, and it is worth pausing on exactly what these two gods actually told him, because the plain, hard truth of this quest, one this story never actually tries to hide from us, is that Perseus himself, whatever courage and whatever eventual cleverness he brought to the task, could never have survived it on his own strength alone. He needed equipment no mortal craftsman anywhere in the known world could have forged for him, and it is worth naming each piece of that equipment individually, because every single one of them is going to matter, in a very specific and very deliberate way, to exactly how the coming confrontation is actually won. He needed a pair of winged sandals, capable of carrying him swiftly across the vast, uncrossable distances separating Seriphos from the edge of the known world where the Gorgons made their home, sandals that belonged, in most tellings of this story, to a group of nymphs whose own location was itself a closely guarded secret. He needed a magical pouch, called in the old Greek a cabesis, large enough to safely hold Medusa's own severed head afterward, without any risk of an accidental glance at whatever power might linger inside it, even once separated from her body. A bag most ancient sources describe as woven or stitched from some soft, close-fitting material, precisely so that it might expand or contract as needed, to hold whatever its own owner required of it. Whether that meant a hunter's ordinary catch or, in this one particular case, a severed head still carrying enough power to turn an unwary glance to solid stone. He needed a cap capable of rendering its wearer entirely invisible, the very same helm of darkness this channel has already named, in the story of Zeus's own rise to kingship, as one of the three great gifts the freed Cyclopes once forged for Hades himself during the war against the Titans, on loan now, for this one particular quest, to a mortal hero who would otherwise have had no possible means of escaping two immortal and considerably enraged sisters once his task was actually finished. It is worth pausing, before we move on to the rest of his own equipment, on what it actually means that this entire quest, from its very first step to its very last, was conducted almost entirely out of sight, because Perseus approached the Grey Eye unseen, approached the sleeping Gorgons unseen, and fled the cave afterward unseen, meaning the single most consequential violence of his own life was carried out by a hero his own victims and their surviving sisters never once had any chance to actually look at. And it is worth sitting with what that particular kind of advantage actually costs a hero's own character across the whole of this tradition's storytelling, because every other confrontation this channel has ever described in this room, Heracles against the Nemean lion, Achilles against Hector, has demanded that the hero stand, at some point, fully visible and fully accountable in front of whatever he was about to do. Perseus alone, among nearly every figure this channel has followed across every other story told in this room, was permitted to do the single most violent thing he ever did without ever once being seen doing it, and it is worth wondering, honestly, whether a victory won entirely by invisibility can really be called courage, in the same sense this tradition usually means by that word, or whether it belongs instead to some quieter, more uncomfortable category. This whole story never quite gives a name to. Cleverness certainly, and resourcefulness without any real question, but perhaps not, in the end, the same plain, exposed bravery this tradition so freely credits him with anyway. And he needed, from Hermes directly, a curved blade of a very particular kind, an adamantine sickle called a harp, sharp and hard enough to cut through flesh no ordinary bronze or iron could ever hope to pierce, a weapon whose own shape, worth pausing on for a moment, echoes directly back to the very same kind of sickle Gaia once fashioned from adamant for her own son Cronus to use against his father Uranus in the story this channel has already told in full. The exact same substance, the exact same curved and merciless edge, now placed in an entirely different hand for an entirely different purpose many generations later. And above everything else Perseus was given, Athena herself provided the single piece of equipment that was actually going to decide whether this entire quest succeeded or failed, a shield polished to such a mirror-bright shine that its bronze surface could reflect an image as clearly and as faithfully as any still pool of water. And it is worth pausing on exactly what that shield actually made possible, because the single most basic problem facing Perseus, more dangerous by far than any question of strength or courage, was the plain mechanical fact that looking directly at Medusa's own face meant instant death, a threat no amount of bravery could simply overpower through force of will, and the shield's true genius, the genius this story wants us to understand belonged to Athena's own wisdom rather than to any strength of Perseus's own, was that it let him see everything he needed to see, the precise angle of his strike, the precise moment to swing, without ever once looking directly at the thing he was actually looking at. But before Perseus could reach the nymphs who held the sandals and the pouch and the cap of invisibility, he first needed to learn exactly where those nymphs actually lived, and the only beings in the whole of the known world who possessed that particular knowledge were the very same 3 grey sisters we named earlier tonight. The grey, sharing a single eye and a single tooth between them at the very edge of the world, not far from their own monstrous Gorgon nieces. A single eye passed hand to hand, and the moment it changed hands one time too many. It is worth pausing before we describe what Perseus actually did on the sheer strange vulnerability built into the Greyer's own existence, because it is a vulnerability this whole story is about to exploit in a way that sits, honestly, somewhere between clever and cruel. The 3 sisters lived together in a twilight so complete that Hesiod himself, in an entirely different context describing an entirely different part of this same family's home, called it a place near the very boundary of night, and because only one of them could ever actually see the world at any given moment, they had developed, across however many centuries or millennia, they had already lived this way, a practiced, careful rhythm of passing their single shared eye from hand to hand, one sister lifting it free just as another reached to take it, a rhythm so old and so automatic to them that none of the 3 had likely given it any real conscious thought in longer than any mortal lifetime could measure. Perseus, guided by Athena's own counsel, positioned himself close enough to observe that rhythm without being seen, and waited for the single, brief instant when the eye was passing between 2 of the sisters' hands, neither one of them yet actually holding it. And it was in that exact instant, when all 3 sisters were simultaneously and completely blind, that he reached out and took the eye for himself. It is worth pausing on the sheer sudden terror that moment must have represented for the 3 sisters, beings who had never, in the whole of their own long existence, experienced total and simultaneous blindness at the same time, suddenly finding themselves plunged into a darkness with no way of knowing whether the hand that had just taken their shared eye belonged to a stranger who meant them harm, or simply to one of their own sisters reaching a moment early. And it is worth sitting, honestly, with how frightening and how disorienting that sudden loss must have actually felt, because this story, for all its later celebration of Perseus's own cleverness in this exact scene, does not ask us to forget that what he actually did was hold 3 helpless, elderly and entirely blinded women hostage until they gave him what he wanted. It is worth pausing for just a moment on how the 3 sisters themselves must have actually experienced the handful of minutes that followed, because this story, so focused on Perseus's own cleverness, gives us almost nothing of their own side of it. 3 voices suddenly speaking into a total and unfamiliar darkness, calling out to one another in a language of half-finished questions, asking which of them was holding the eye now, asking whether anyone had felt a stranger's hand, asking, with a rising and entirely understandable panic, whether this darkness was simply an ordinary and momentary confusion between sisters, or something considerably more permanent and considerably more frightening. 3 ancient beings who had shared every single sighted moment of their own impossibly long lives suddenly and totally cut off from one another and from the world outside all at once, with no way of knowing, in those first disorienting seconds, whether the eye had simply slipped from one sister's grasp by ordinary accident, or had been taken from all 3 of them entirely. Perseus told the Grey plainly that he would return their shared eye only once they told him where the nymphs who held Athena's own required equipment could be found, and the sisters, with no real alternative and no way of overpowering a sighted young man while they themselves remained completely blind, told him what he needed to know. Some tellings say Perseus kept his word and returned the eye once he had the information he needed. Others say he simply cast it into a nearby lake and left the 3 sisters to recover it themselves as best they could, permanently blinded, at least for a time, by a young hero's own single act of ruthless practical cleverness. And it is worth pausing on the honest disagreement between these 2 endings, because this story never actually settles which one is true, and it is worth sitting for just a moment with the discomfort of a hero this whole tradition otherwise wants us to admire, doing something in this one particular scene that reads considerably less like courage and considerably more like a young man taking advantage of 3 ancient blinded women simply because he could. It is worth pausing before we follow Perseus to them on exactly who these nymphs actually were, because the old sources themselves are not entirely of one mind on the question. Some tellings placing them in a hidden and otherwise unnamed corner of the far north, beyond even the icy homeland of a people the Greeks called the Hyperboreans, those who dwell beyond the north wind, and other tellings identifying them instead with the Hesperides, the very same nymphs of the evening and the setting sun this channel's listeners have already heard named in the story of Zeus as the keepers of the golden apples guarded by the dragon Ladon at the far western edge of the world. It is worth sitting with that geographical confusion for a moment, rather than trying to resolve it, because it tells us something honest about how loosely this whole tradition actually treated the literal map of its own stories, far less interested, across every single telling this channel has brought into this room, in pinning down an exact and consistent location for its own magical geography, than in simply placing anything sufficiently strange and sufficiently powerful at whatever distant edge of the known world a given story happened to need it at. With the nymph's location finally in hand, Perseus travelled on and received from them, freely and without any further trickery required, the wing sandals, the magic pouch, and the cap of invisibility. And it is worth pausing on that contrast, because it means this quest, across its full length, actually offered Perseus two entirely different templates for how power might be gathered, one built on ambush and coercion against three helpless sisters who had done him no harm at all, and one built on simple, freely offered generosity from nymphs who gave him exactly what he needed without requiring any threat or trick to do it. And it is worth carrying that contrast with you into the rest of tonight's story, because the question of which of those two templates a hero actually chooses to rely on, force taken from the vulnerable or gifts freely given by the willing, is a question this whole broader tradition, across every story it has ever told in this room, keeps circling back to again and again. Fully equipped at last, sandals fastened to his own ankles, the cap tucked safely away until the moment he would truly need it, the curved blade at his side, and Athena's own mirrored shield carried close, Perseus rose into the air and flew west, or in some telling south, toward the edge of the known world where three sleeping sisters waited in a cave ringed by the proof of every mistake that had ever reached them before him. It is worth pausing briefly on what that first true flight must have actually felt like for a young man who had, until this exact moment, spent the whole of his own life walking on ordinary ground, the sudden dizzying drop of the coastline falling away beneath him, the particular cold of open air at a height no mortal had any ordinary business reaching, the strange, urgent lightness of sandals doing work his own legs had never once been asked to do, and it is worth sitting with that mixture of wonder and terror for a moment, because it means Perseus's own quest had already, before he had even reached his actual target, asked him to survive an entirely new and entirely unfamiliar kind of fear, one this story rarely gets any credit for including at all. A field of statues grown wider still, and a young man who understood at last exactly what he was flying toward. It is worth pausing as Perseus finally draws near to that same cave we described at the very opening of tonight's story, on what he must have actually felt looking down, from the air, at that field of frozen figures spread out below him, men and beasts alike caught forever in whatever motion had carried them, unknowing, into Medusa's own line of sight, because every single one of those figures represented, in the most literal and immediate way this story could possibly offer, exactly what awaited him the instant his own resolve slipped even once. It is worth pausing too on the particular discipline Athena's own counsel demanded of him from this point forward, a discipline that ran directly against every ordinary instinct a warrior carries into any other kind of battle. This whole tradition has ever described, because every other hero this channel has followed across every other story, Heracles facing down the Nemean lion, Achilles facing Hector beneath the walls of Troy, has been asked, at the decisive moment, to look their enemy directly in the eye. Perseus was asked to do the exact opposite, to fly toward the most dangerous confrontation of his entire life while deliberately, constantly refusing to look at the thing he had come to kill, trusting instead a reflection in a piece of polished bronze to tell him everything he needed to know. He landed in most tellings at the cave's own entrance while the three sisters still slept, and it is worth pausing on the timing this story insists upon, because Medusa's death, in nearly every surviving version of this myth, comes to her not in any waking confrontation at all, but in her sleep, unaware and unable to defend herself in any way, a detail this telling is not going to let pass without comment, because it means the single most famous monster slaying in the whole of Greek mythology was never actually a fair fight of any kind, was never a contest of strength or skill. Medusa herself had any real chance to win, or even to properly begin. But an ambush carried out against a sleeping woman by a young man wielding gifts from two gods, one shield reflecting her own face safely back at him, and one blade sharp enough to end her life before she had ever opened her eyes to see who had come for her. Guided entirely by the mirrored image in his own shield rather than by any direct sight of his target, Perseus approached the sleeping Gorgon sisters, and it is worth pausing on how the old sources describe him actually distinguishing Medusa from Stheno and Euryale, because even asleep, even reduced entirely to a reflection viewed through polished bronze, he still had to be certain he was striking the one mortal sister among three otherwise identical immortal ones, a certainty this story credits in most tellings to Athena's own direct guidance, her hand steadying his own at the decisive instant, making sure the blade found exactly the neck it needed to find and no other. It is worth pausing one final time on the sheer, total silence Athena's own counsel demanded of Perseus in this exact moment, because it was not enough for him simply to avoid looking at Medusa directly. He had to trust an indirect image completely, moment after moment, with no room at all for the ordinary human impulse to double-check, to glance quickly and instinctively toward whatever his own body was actually doing, an impulse this telling suspects very few listeners tonight could actually suppress with the same total discipline this story asks us to believe he somehow managed. And it is worth wondering, honestly, whether that discipline was ever really his own alone to claim, or whether it belonged, in the end, considerably more to the goddess steadying his hand than to any courage Perseus himself actually possessed. It is worth pausing, before we describe the actual strike itself, on the sheer physical difficulty of what Athena and Hermes were actually asking a mortal body to accomplish, because this was never simply a matter of glancing occasionally at a shield, instead of directly at a target. Perseus had to fly, low and controlled, on sandals he had only recently learned to trust, while holding a polished bronze shield at precisely the angle needed to keep Medusa's own sleeping form reflected clearly within it, all while reaching, blind to his own actual target in any direct sense, with a curved blade sharp enough that a single misjudged inch in either direction meant either a wasted strike that would wake three furious Gorgons at once, or worse, an accidental downward glance at the exact wrong instant that would end his own life before the blade had even finished its own swing. It is worth sitting with how much trust that single approach actually required. Not simply courage in the ordinary sense this tradition usually asks of its heroes, facing an enemy directly and overpowering it through strength or skill, but a far stranger and far more disciplined trust in an indirect image, a willingness to let a reflection guide a blade toward a target. His own eyes were never permitted to confirm directly, and it is worth noticing that this is, in its own way, one of the least glorified and most genuinely difficult feats any hero this channel has ever described in this room was actually asked to perform. With Athena's guidance and the reflected image steady in his shield, Perseus struck, and Medusa's head came away from her own body in a single stroke of the adamantine blade Hermes had given him, and it is worth pausing on what the old poets tell us happened in that exact same instant, because it is one of the strangest and most striking images this entire story ever produces. From the wound at her own severed neck sprang two entirely new beings, fully formed in the very moment of her death, offspring conceived, we may recall from earlier tonight during Poseidon's own assault upon her, carried inside her all this time and finally only now given the chance to be born. One was Pegasus, a winged horse of dazzling white, who would go on, across countless later stories this tradition tells, to carry heroes across the sky and to strike, with a single hoof blow against a mountainside, the spring from which the muses themselves were said to draw their own inspiration. The other was Chrysa, whose own name meant, in the Old Greek, the golden sword or the man with the golden blade, a giant destined to father, in generations still ahead of this story's own telling, further strange and monstrous descendants of his own. It is worth pausing honestly on the sheer strangeness of that image, life springing directly out of the exact moment of death, a mother's final wound becoming, in the very same instant, her own children's first breath, because it means Medusa's death and her own motherhood arrived at literally the same moment, two events this whole tradition almost never allows to happen simultaneously anywhere else, and it is worth sitting with what that simultaneity actually implies about the pregnancy itself, carried silently and invisibly inside her for however long the span of time between Poseidon's assault and Perseus's own arrival actually was, a burden she carried entirely alone in a cave at the edge of the world, guarded by two immortal sisters who could offer her company but never any real understanding of what she alone, among the three of them, was actually going through. It is worth pausing too on where these same two children actually went once their own mother's story had ended, because neither Pegasus nor Chrysa simply vanish from this wider tradition the moment they are born, and their own later lives are worth naming here briefly, because they carry Medusa's own memory forward into stories this channel may well tell in full on some other night. Pegasus, the winged horse, flew first to Olympus itself, where he came to serve Zeus directly, carrying the god's own thunder and lightning in a role of real honour rather than any lingering shame attached to his own mother's fate. And it was Pegasus, in a later story belonging properly to an entirely different hero, who allowed a young man named Bellerophon to defeat the fire-breathing Chimera, a monster this same wider tradition also traced back to Echidna's own monstrous line, striking it down from the air where its own flames and its own lion's jaws could never quite reach him, before Bellerophon's own pride eventually undid him, and Pegasus, in the story's own telling, threw his rider from his back rather than carry him all the way to Olympus uninvited, continuing on alone afterward to be placed at last among the stars as the constellation that still bears his name today. Chrysa, the golden sword giant, went on to father a monstrous son of his own, a three-bodied giant named Geryon who kept a herd of magnificent red cattle on a distant western island, and it was Geryon's own cattle that Heracles was sent to capture as one of his own famous 12 labours, a task this channel has already told in full in an earlier night in this room, killing Geryon in the process and closing without either hero ever quite realising it, a small and quiet loop connecting Medusa's own bloodline directly into the story of the single greatest hero this whole tradition ever produced, a golden sword grandson and a lion-skinned demigod meeting generations apart on opposite ends of a family line neither one of them had any particular reason to think about at all. It is worth returning one final time to the young traveller this telling imagined for you earlier tonight, standing frozen at the edge of that same cave with his own father's sword still raised and his own mother's blessing still fresh in his memory, because it is worth naming plainly that Perseus' own success changed nothing at all for him. He remains exactly where this story left him, stone among stone, and he is going to remain there for the whole of tonight's story and for every night that follows it as well, because Medusa's death did not undo a single one of the transformations she had already caused, only ensured that no further name would ever be added to that same silent field. It is worth sitting with that small, unresolved detail for a moment before we move on, because it means Perseus's own victory, celebrated as it was going to go on being celebrated for 3,000 years afterward, arrived too late to matter at all to every single traveller who had already made this same climb before him. Two sisters woken by a scream they could not source, and a grief this story rarely lets us properly measure. Perseus, the instant Medusa's head was safely secured inside the magic pouch Athena had given him, had only a matter of moments before Stheno and Euryale woke to discover their own sister dead beside them, and it is worth pausing, before we follow him into the frantic flight that comes next, on what those two sisters must have actually experienced in that same instant, because this story, so thoroughly focused on Perseus's own escape, almost never bothers to give either of them the same interior life this channel has tried, across other nights in this room, to grant even to this tradition's most minor and most overlooked figures. Two immortal beings waking from sleep to find the one mortal member of their own small family already dead, her body already growing cold beside them, no enemy in sight to strike back against because the enemy responsible was already fleeing, invisible, through the open air above their own heads, and it is worth sitting for a moment in the particular horror of grief with no target, rage with nothing left to strike, because Stheno and Euryale, immortal as they were never going to have the mercy of eventually joining their sister in death, condemned instead to carry this exact loss forward for the whole of an unending existence that had no natural endpoint at which the grief itself might finally be allowed to rest. It is worth pausing, too, on what became of Stheno and Euryale across all the centuries this story has continued to be told since, because no ancient source ever tells us their own grief eventually eased, or that either sister ever left that same cave to build any life beyond it. It is worth imagining them there still, in whatever way you find most fitting tonight, two immortal beings who will never age and will never die, keeping a kind of endless, unrequested watch over a stretch of coastline that long ago stopped drawing any careless travellers at all, because the one thing that ever made that particular cave worth the journey was carried away by a stranger who never once looked either of them in the eye, and it is worth sitting with the particular loneliness of an eternity spent guarding an emptiness, because it may be the single saddest and least remembered detail in this whole 3,000-year-old story. The two sisters rose in pursuit regardless, screaming, by every account this story preserves, with a sound the old poets describe as unlike anything a mortal ear had ever endured, a wailing so raw and so unbearable that later Greek religious tradition, worth pausing on here even though it belongs properly to a much later part of tonight's telling, credited Athena herself with having invented an entirely new musical instrument, a double reed pipe called the aulos, specifically in an attempt to reproduce, in music, the exact sound of that same grief-stricken cry, a detail this telling is going to return to more fully when we reach the section of tonight's story devoted to how the ancient world actually preserved and passed down everything we have been describing. It is worth pausing one final time on the field of frozen travellers this telling has already asked you to hold in mind across everything that has happened since, because their own particular stillness rhymes, in its own quiet way, with another eternal punishment this channel's listeners have already encountered in the story of Zeus, the mortal king Tantalus, condemned to stand forever beneath fruit that lifted just out of reach, and water that receded the instant he bent to drink it, an agony of endless, unanswerable want. The men frozen outside Medusa's own cave suffered a considerably faster ending than Tantalus's own slow, repeating torment, but the same underlying shape connects them regardless. Desire interrupted at the exact instant of its own fulfillment and held there, unresolved, for the whole of an eternity neither man had any choice in accepting, one more small and unexpected echo, linking this whole night's story back into the same wider tradition this channel has already spent so many other nights exploring. Perseus, protected by the cap of invisibility, and guided by winged sandals fast enough to outrun even two furious and immortal pursuers, escaped the cave and the whole of that grieving, screaming pursuit, And it is worth pausing one final time on the fact that Stheno and Euryale never actually caught him, never received any justice or even any confrontation for what had just been taken from them, left instead to return, eventually to a cave that would now hold only the two of them, forever, for as long as the world itself continued turning. It is worth pausing, before we follow Perseus onward into the long flight still ahead of him, to gather together for just a moment everything tonight's story has already asked your own senses to hold, because this whole telling has moved quickly across a great deal of ground already. The dry whispering hiss of serpents shifting against stone in an otherwise silent cave, the flat, colourless shine of polished bronze held carefully at arm's length, showing everything except the one thing it was actually pointed at. The particular, high, wordless wail of two immortal sisters waking into a grief with no target and no end. The dull, final weight of a severed head settling into the bottom of a leather pouch. It is worth carrying all four of those sensations forward together now, because the rest of tonight's story is going to keep returning to variations on every single one of them. Reflection standing in for sight, silence standing in for safety, weight standing in for consequence, again and again, all the way to the very end of this long night's telling. Before we drift into the rest of this story, take a quiet moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you feel like it, leave your location and your local time down in the comments. It helps other restless, sleepless people find their way to this little corner of the night, and there is something pleasant about knowing that somewhere far away, a stranger is settling under the same dark sky, listening to the same slow story. So get comfortable. Let your shoulders sink a little further into the bed and settle back in, because we still have a long and unhurried way left to go tonight. A trail of blood across an empty desert, and a whole new danger born from every drop. Perseus, carrying Medusa's severed head safely sealed away inside its pouch, flew on from that cave across a vast stretch of open country the old poets identify as Libya, and it is worth pausing on what the old sources tell us happened along that particular stretch of his own journey home, because it is one of this story's most vivid pieces of pure etiology, the kind of explanatory myth this whole broader tradition loved to attach to any strange or unexplained feature of the actual physical world its listeners lived inside. Drops of blood, the old poets tell us, fell from the severed head as Perseus carried it across the sky above that same desert, and wherever each drop touched the sand below, a venomous serpent was born, springing directly up out of the ground exactly where the blood had landed. And it is worth pausing on why this particular story became attached to this particular stretch of geography, because the ancient Greek world genuinely understood the deserts of North Africa to be unusually rich in dangerous venomous snakes, and this myth offered a satisfying, if entirely fanciful, explanation for why that should be true, tracing every single one of those serpents back to a single flight, a single severed head, and a single trail of blood spilled across an empty landscape that had, until that exact moment, known no snakes at all. It is worth pausing, before we follow Perseus any further on this same journey home, on what he himself must have actually been carrying in the hours immediately after leaving that cave, because this tradition, so interested in the mechanics of magical equipment and monstrous obstacles, rarely stops to ask what a young man is supposed to do with a memory of what he has just done. He had killed a sleeping woman, watched two of her own children spring still wet from the wound that had ended her, and fled through open air while her own two immortal sisters screamed behind him in a grief. This telling has already asked you to sit with honestly, and it is worth wondering, honestly, whether the triumph this whole tradition wants us to feel on his behalf ever actually settled cleanly into Perseus's own chest at all, or whether some smaller, quieter part of him carried that same cave forward with him for the whole rest of his own life, the way this channel's listeners already know from an earlier telling in this very room, that even a hero as celebrated as Heracles was never quite able to fully set down the weight of what his own hands had done. It was somewhere along this same journey, in one of the several competing versions this whole tradition offers for exactly how and when it happened, that Perseus encountered a Titan. This channel's listeners have already met once before, in the earlier telling of Zeus's own long war against the old order of gods. Atlas, condemned in that earlier story to hold the whole weight of the sky upon his own shoulders for choosing the losing side in the war against the Titans, appears in several later tellings of Perseus's own story as well, and it is worth pausing on how these two separate strands of the wider tradition were eventually woven together, because the later poets who added this encounter to Perseus's own journey were not content simply to let Atlas continue his unending labour unremarked. In this later telling, Perseus, weary from his own long flight, sought shelter and hospitality from Atlas, who ruled, in this particular version of the story, over a distant western kingdom rich with golden fruit, and Atlas, having once received a warning of his own that a son of Zeus would someday come to steal that same golden fruit away from him, refused Perseus any hospitality at all and attempted, in his own exhaustion and his own long-nursed fear, to drive the young hero away by force. Perseus, given no other choice and unwilling, by this point in his own journey, to be turned away from a request as ordinary and as sacred as hospitality, drew Medusa's head from its pouch and showed it Atlas directly, and the great Titan, still bent forward under the weight of the sky he had carried for generations uncounted, turned instantly and permanently to stone, his own vast straining form becoming in that single instant an actual mountain range, the very mountains that still bear his own name today, along the northwestern edge of the African continent, a transformation this later tradition wanted its audience to understand not as any cruelty inflicted on top of his existing punishment, but as a strange and almost merciful conclusion to it. A Titan who had held up the sky in agony for longer than any measure of time could properly account, now doing the exact same work forever, but as unfeeling stone rather than as a living, suffering body, an ending some later tellings genuinely frame as the closest thing to rest Atlas's own long punishment was ever going to offer him, a chained princess and a monster sent by the sea to answer a mother's own pride. Perseus's journey home was not yet finished, and it is worth pausing before we follow him into its single most celebrated episode, on where exactly this next encounter actually takes place, because the old sources place it in a kingdom called Ethiopia, ruled by a king named Cepheus and a queen named Cassiopeia, and it is worth naming honestly that ancient geography treated this name considerably more loosely than any modern atlas would allow, sometimes locating this kingdom along the eastern coast of Africa and sometimes, in later tellings, along the eastern shore of the Mediterranean itself. A vagueness this story is going to leave exactly as uncertain as the ancient sources themselves left it, because pinning down an exact modern location was never actually the point of the story to begin with. Cassiopeia, the queen of that kingdom, had made a boast, in the days before Perseus's own arrival, that she, or in some tellings, her own daughter Andromeda, was more beautiful than the Nereids themselves, the 50 gentle sea nymph daughters of old Nereus this story named at its very own beginning tonight, and it is worth pausing on how familiar this exact shape of story should already feel to anyone who has followed this channel across other nights in this room, because mortal boasting against the gods, the very sin this tradition would later come to call hubris, almost never goes unanswered for very long. It is worth naming again, briefly, exactly what that word actually meant to the ancient audiences who first used it, a concept this channel has already defined once before in the story of Zeus as something considerably more specific than simple pride, a mortal forgetting or refusing to accept the plain and fixed difference between what a human being was permitted to claim for themselves and what belonged to the gods alone. Cassiopeia's own particular version of that same forgetting was almost disarmingly ordinary, a mother's boast about her own daughter's beauty, the kind of small human vanity that costs nothing at all in any ordinary household, and it is worth sitting with how disproportionate the response to it actually turned out to be, an entire kingdom terrorized, and one innocent daughter very nearly killed over words that, in any household lacking gods listening close enough to take offence, would have been forgotten within the week. Poseidon, hearing of Cassiopeia's boast and taking it, as this whole tradition's gods so consistently do, as a personal insult against the honour of beings under his own particular protection, sent a sea monster called Cetus to ravage the whole of that kingdom's own coastline. And it is worth pausing on the particular cruelty of how that same god, already responsible for what had happened to Medusa in an entirely earlier chapter of tonight's story, was once again the direct source of the violence about to unfold, a pattern this whole night's telling is quietly asking you to notice. A single, restless, ungoverned power responsible, across two entirely separate strands of this same story, for setting in motion the exact suffering that a mortal woman would then be made to bear on his behalf. It is worth pausing, before we follow Cepheus to that same oracle, on what the actual weeks before Perseus's own arrival must have felt like along that particular stretch of coastline, because the old sources characteristically move quickly past this part of the story, on their way to the more dramatic rescue still to come, but it is worth imagining it honestly regardless. A kingdom whose own fishing boats no longer dared leave harbour, whose own coastal villages had begun standing empty as families fled inland ahead of a danger none of them had ever seen with their own eyes, but all of them had already heard described in whatever terrified, exaggerated detail travels fastest along a threatened coast, whose own priests and elders gathered again and again to argue over what, exactly, their own king and queen's careless pride had actually cost them, a whole community forced to live, for however many weeks or months this particular ordeal actually lasted, with a specific, grinding uncertainty of knowing that some further and more permanent price was still coming, and that it was almost certainly not going to be paid by the two people whose own boast had actually caused it. Cepheus, desperate to save his own kingdom from the monster's continued rampage, consulted an oracle and received an answer that should, by now, feel grimly familiar to anyone who has followed the pattern of prophecy and sacrifice running underneath so much of this whole broader tradition. The only way to appease Poseidon's own anger, the oracle told him, was to offer up his own daughter Andromeda as a sacrifice, chaining her to a rock along the very shoreline the monster had been ravaging, and leaving her there to be devoured. And it is worth pausing on the plain, brutal arithmetic of that solution. A father's own boast, or a mother's own boast made on a daughter's behalf, answered in the end by that same daughter's own body, offered up to settle a debt she herself had never incurred. One more entry. This story wants us to notice. In the same long ledger this whole night has already been keeping of costs borne by women for choices and boasts and desires that were never actually their own. Perseus, flying home across that same coastline with Medusa's head safely secured, saw Andromeda chained to her rock, and it is worth pausing on what he actually saw in that moment, because the old poets describe him as struck, immediately and completely, by her beauty even in the depths of her own terror, a beauty this tradition frames, in nearly every telling, as inseparable from the very real courage she was already showing simply by facing her own approaching death without collapsing entirely. And it is worth sitting with the honest complexity of that framing. A young hero falling in love at first sight with a chained and terrified woman. Because this story never quite lets us forget how strange a foundation that actually is for the marriage that follows, however genuinely devoted the two of them go on to become across the rest of this tradition's telling. Perseus descended and spoke with Andromeda directly, learning the full story of her family's own boast and her own resulting sentence. And it is worth pausing on what the old sources actually tell us about that first exchange between them, because they describe her, even chained and awaiting what she had every reason to believe was her own certain death, answering his questions clearly and steadily, rather than collapsing into the kind of helpless weeping this tradition so often defaults to whenever it depicts a woman in danger, naming her own parents, her own kingdom, and her own family's own boast plainly and without excuse, a composure this telling wants to sit with for a moment, because it means Andromeda entered this whole story already possessing exactly the kind of clear-eyed steadiness under pressure this tradition usually reserves only for its heroes, offered here, briefly and almost in passing, to a woman most retellings remember only for having been rescued. Perseus negotiated with her father Cepheus for her hand in marriage in exchange for saving her life. A bargain Cepheus, watching his own daughter's death approach with no better option of his own, accepted immediately and without any real hesitation. It is worth pausing briefly on what this particular monster actually looked like in the ancient imagination, because later ages, familiar with actual whales from centuries of Mediterranean seafaring, sometimes pictured Cetus as an enormous whale-like beast, but the earlier surviving Greek vase paintings depicting this same story give us something considerably stranger. A creature with a serpent's own coiling body and a head closer to a dog's or a wolf's than to any fish at all, jaws lined with visible teeth, and a long, sinuous neck rearing up out of the water toward the chained princess. An image that owes considerably more to this tradition's own wider catalogue of seaborne horrors, the same catalogue that produced Medusa's own family many hours ago in tonight's telling, than to anything an ancient sailor would actually have recognised swimming past his own boat. As Cetus itself finally rose from the sea, a creature the old poets describe in terms genuinely worthy of the terror it was meant to inspire. Vast and scaled and hungry, bearing down on the chained and helpless Andromeda with the full weight of Poseidon's own anger behind it, Perseus met the monster in open combat, and it is worth pausing on the genuine disagreement among the ancient sources over exactly how he actually killed it, because some tellings have him striking the beast down with Hermes' own adamantine blade in a fight fought entirely on his own strength and skill, while others have him reaching, once again, for the single most powerful weapon in his own possession, drawing Medusa's head from its pouch one final time and turning the monster to stone exactly as he had already done to Atlas, a detail worth pausing on because it means the very head this whole story has spent so long describing as a burden, a horror, a thing to be carried carefully and never looked at directly, had by this point in Perseus's own journey become something else entirely, a weapon he could reach for and deploy at exactly the moment of his own choosing, Medusa's own suffering repurposed again and again into whatever this particular quest happened to require of it next. With Cetus destroyed and Andromeda finally freed from her chains, the wedding that Cepheus had promised went forward, but it's worth pausing on one final complication this story insists on including before it will let this particular episode reach any comfortable rest, because Andromeda, before Perseus's own arrival, had already been promised in marriage to a different man entirely, her own uncle, a king named Phineus, and it is worth pausing on what happened when that same wedding feast, meant to celebrate Perseus and Andromeda's own new union, was interrupted by Phineus himself, arriving with a company of armed men, and declaring that Andromeda had already been promised to him, and that he had no intention of allowing another man to take her. What followed was a violent battle inside the very hall where the wedding feast had been laid. Tables overturned and wine spilled across a floor that had been swept and polished only hours before for a celebration. Torches guttering in the sudden chaos as guests who had come to witness a marriage instead found themselves scrambling for whatever weapon lay closest to hand. Perseus and his own small handful of allies badly outnumbered by Phineus's own armed company, until Perseus, cornered and with no other way of turning the fight in his own favour, once again drew Medusa's head from its pouch, warning his own remaining allies to look away, and turned Phineus and every one of his armed men to stone where they stood, ending the battle in a single instant with a weapon no ordinary blade could ever hope to match. It is worth pausing, honestly, on how strange and how uncomfortable that particular use of Medusa's own head actually is, because it means the single most consequential act of violence in this entire episode was not committed by the sea monster Poseidon had sent, nor by Phineus's own armed company, but by Perseus himself deploying a wronged woman's own final suffering as a weapon of mass, permanent destruction against an entire hall full of men, some of whom, this story is honest enough to admit, may have had genuine and reasonable grievances of their own about a broken marriage promise, even if their armed response to it went considerably too far. It is worth sitting with that discomfort rather than resolving it, because it is one more small piece of evidence, in a story already full of them, that this whole tradition never actually lets Perseus's own heroism sit entirely uncomplicated, even at the exact moment it is celebrating his own triumph most loudly. It is worth pausing before we leave this whole episode behind on where every single person involved in it eventually came to rest, because this particular chapter of tonight's story left behind one of the most vivid and most enduring traces in the entire night sky, a whole cluster of neighbouring constellations that any sufficiently patient stargazer can still pick out today on a clear autumn evening. Cepheus and Cassiopeia were both placed among the stars once their own mortal lives had ended, and it is worth naming honestly that Cassiopeia's own placement carried within it one final, pointed piece of divine justice for the boast that started this whole episode in the first place, because several ancient sources tell us she was set into the ski-bound to her own throne in such a position that, for roughly half of every single night across the whole year, she appears to hang upside down, a small, permanent, and rather undignified reminder of exactly the kind of pride that had once endangered her own daughter's life. Andromeda herself was placed nearby, still shown in the star charts later astronomers eventually drew, with her arms stretched outward in something close to the same position she once held chained to that rock along the coastline. Perseus was set into the sky as well, not far from his own bride, in most depictions still shown holding the very same head that had made his entire journey possible, and Cetus, the sea monster itself, was given its own considerably fainter and more sprawling constellation nearby. Condemned, this telling suspects with some quiet satisfaction to spend the whole of eternity chasing a bride it would never actually reach. It is worth sitting with that image for a moment, an entire family's worst night endlessly replayed across the whole of the visible sky, precisely so that no one looking upward on a clear night ever afterward could entirely forget it. A homecoming and a debt of gratitude finally repaid. Perseus and Andromeda, married at last and settled for a time in her own father's kingdom, before finally setting out for home, made their way back towards Seriphos, and it is worth pausing on what he actually found waiting for him there, because the years of his own long quest had not been kind to either his mother or the fisherman who had raised him. Polydectes, believing Perseus dead or lost somewhere at the edge of the known world, had continued pressing Danae toward a marriage she had no wish to enter, and Danae, together with Dictys, had been forced to take refuge at a sacred altar, the one place in the whole of Polydectes' own kingdom where ancient custom still forbade him from simply seizing her by force, a small precarious sanctuary that had held only as long as Polydectes himself continued to respect the religious custom protecting it. Perseus arrived at Polydectes' own court, and it is worth pausing on the particular symmetry of what happened next, because the same rash promise that had once sent him away on a quest meant to kill him was, by this point in the story, fully and completely fulfilled, and Polydectes, confronted at last with the young man he had never expected to see again, mocked him openly in front of his own assembled court, refusing to believe Perseus had actually accomplished the task he had been sent to complete. Perseus, in answer, drew Medusa's head from its pouch one final time, warning whatever allies he had brought with him to look away, and turned Polydectes and the whole of his own loyal court to stone in a single instant, ending with the very same weapon that had already ended Atlas and Cetus and Phineus's armed company, the years-long threat this particular king had posed to his own mother's safety. It is worth pausing for a moment on what the ordinary people of Seriphos must have actually made of what they found in that same hall afterward, because a king and his own entire assembled court, men who had eaten and argued and ruled that same island only hours before, were now simply gone, replaced by an unmoving gallery of stone figures still holding their own half-finished cups and still wearing, on more than one face, the exact sneering disbelief they had been wearing in the instant Perseus proved them wrong. It is worth imagining the particular uneasy silence that must have settled over that island in the days that followed. An entire community trying to reconcile the ordinary, familiar faces of men they had known their whole lives with the cold, unmoving stone those same faces had become. And it is worth naming too that this was very likely the first and only time most of Seriphos' own ordinary residents had ever actually seen, with their own eyes, physical proof of the exact power this whole story has spent so many hours describing, proof that had, until that single afternoon, existed for them only as a rumour carried back from the edge of the known world by a young man none of them had ever expected to return home at all. It is worth pausing on what Perseus did immediately afterward, because it tells us something genuinely worth noticing about the shape of character this whole story has been quietly building across everything we have described tonight. Rather than claiming Seriphos' own throne for himself, a throne now sitting entirely empty and entirely his for the taking, Perseus instead made Dictys, the fisherman who had drawn a wooden chest containing a terrified mother and her infant son out of the open sea so many years before, and raised that same son as his own without ever once asking anything in return. The new king of the island, a debt of gratitude repaid in full, and it is worth sitting with that choice for a moment, because it stands in real and pointed contrast to nearly every other use this story has already shown us of Medusa's own final power, a weapon so far turned against an unsuspecting sea monster, a hospitality-refusing titan, an armed wedding crasher, and a cruel and manipulative king, now finally put down, at least for a moment, in favour of a simple act of loyalty, rewarded rather than any further violence at all. A pouch returned, a shield given back, and a head that found its own final home. With his own quest at last complete, Perseus returned the magical equipment that had made it possible in the first place, the winged sandals, the pouch, and the cap of invisibility passing back into Hermes' own keeping, to be returned, in turn, to the nymphs who had first lent them, and it is worth pausing on the plain, unglamorous honesty of that return. A hero who had been given extraordinary gifts for a specific and limited purpose, giving every single one of them back the moment that purpose was actually fulfilled, taking nothing more for himself than the task itself had actually required. Athena's own shield, too, was returned to her, and it was to Athena in nearly every telling this tradition preserves that Perseus finally gave Medusa's own severed head as well, a gift this story asks us to sit with carefully, because it means the wronged woman's own final remains passed in the end directly into the keeping of the very goddess who, in one entire strand of this story's own tradition, bore direct responsibility for what had been done to her in the first place. It is worth pausing for just a moment on what that final handoff must have actually felt like from Perseus's own side of it, because it meant setting down, for good, the single object that had defined nearly every choice he had made since the day he first left Seriphos, a weapon he had carried invisibly through the sky, deployed against a hospitality-refusing titan, and a rampaging sea monster, and an armed wedding party, and a cruel and manipulative king, and it is worth wondering whether handing it over to Athena at last brought him anything close to relief, or whether some part of him had, by that point in his own long journey, grown so accustomed to carrying that particular weight that its own absence afterward felt, if anything, stranger than the weight itself ever had. Athena, receiving the head, mounted it at the very centre of her own aegis, the goatskin shield or breastplate this whole broader tradition consistently depicts her wearing into battle, and it is worth pausing on what that final placement actually meant, because Medusa's face, once fixed there, ceased to be simply a trophy of Perseus's own victory, and became instead a permanent and functional part of Athena's own protective equipment. An image so terrible that any enemy who so much as glimpsed it in the chaos of battle would be struck, if not with literal petrification, then at least with the same overwhelming, paralysing dread the actual gaze had once inspired in every living creature unlucky enough to encounter it directly. It is worth pausing too on the particular word later ages came to use for this exact image, the Gorgonean, a stylised, wide-eyed, often tongue-bearing face that would go on, across the whole of the following several centuries, to become one of the single, most widely reproduced protective images the entire ancient Mediterranean world ever produced. Carved above doorways and painted onto shields and stamped into the centre of countless roof tiles and drinking cups. A monster's own face transformed through this single act of Athena's own final placement into one of antiquity's most trusted forms of protection. It is worth pausing, honestly, on the deep strangeness of that transformation, because it means the very same face that had once turned any careless traveller permanently to stone became, once fixed to Athena's own shield, something the ancient world actively wanted looking back at it from doorways and battle standards and household walls, a horror repurposed into a guardian, and it is worth sitting with how neatly and how uncomfortably that final transformation echoes. The very name Medusa herself was given at her own birth. Guardian, ruler, the one who protects. A name this telling asked you, many hours ago now, to hold on to carefully, because it turns out that even after everything done to her, and everything done in her name, this is the one role this whole tradition ultimately allowed her to keep. There is one further detail worth naming before we let Medusa's own severed head finally rest, because it belongs to this same story, and it carries its own small, strange mercy inside it. Athena, in several tellings preserved by later mythographers, gave 2 vials of Medusa's own blood to Asclepius, the god of healing this channel's listeners may already know from other stories told elsewhere, and it is worth pausing on the particular, unsettling symmetry of what those 2 vials actually contained, because blood drawn from the veins on the left side of Medusa's own body was said to be a poison so deadly that no cure existed for it anywhere in the whole of the ancient world, while blood drawn from the veins on her right side carried the exact opposite power, capable, in the hands of a skilled enough healer, of curing any illness, and even, in the most extreme tellings, of raising the recently dead back to life. It is worth sitting with that final image for a moment, a single body, transformed once into a monster, and then a second time into a trophy, still carrying inside it, even after death, both the single most lethal poison and the single most powerful cure the ancient imagination could conceive of, holding, quite literally within her own veins, the exact same both intention. This whole story has been asking us to hold in our own minds across everything we have described tonight. It is worth naming too what Asclepius himself eventually did with that gift, because this same wider tradition tells us he grew, across the years that followed, so skilled at using Medusa's own restorative blood that he began raising the dead back to life in genuinely significant numbers, a practice that eventually drew the attention, and then the considerable alarm of Hades himself, who complained to his own brother Zeus that the whole natural order of mortal life and mortal death, the order this channel's listeners have already watched Zeus spend an entire earlier story establishing and defending, was being quietly undone by a single healer's own growing skill with a dead Gorgon's own blood. Zeus, hearing that complaint and agreeing that no mortal healer, however gifted, should be permitted to erase death itself so freely, struck Asclepius down with a thunderbolt, ending his own life in the same instant it had spent so many others' lives, and it is worth sitting with the particular, layered irony of that ending, because it means the single most powerful gift Medusa's own death produced, capable of undoing death itself in the right hands, was eventually silenced by the very same weapon and the very same king. This channel has already followed through an entire earlier night's telling. One more small and unexpected thread quietly stitching this whole story back into everything that came before it. A discus thrown at a funeral games and a prophecy that finally quietly came true. It is worth returning now, before we move into the final sections of tonight's telling, to the single oldest thread this whole story has been carrying since long before Medusa herself ever entered it, the prophecy that first sent Danae and her infant son adrift on the open sea, warning old King Acrisius that a grandson of his own blood was destined one day to kill him. Acrisius, hearing eventually that Perseus had not only survived his own exile but returned home triumphant, fled Argos entirely rather than risk any direct encounter with the grandson he had spent his own son's entire lifetime trying to avoid, travelling to the distant city of Larissa, where, in most tellings, a funeral games or an athletic competition of some kind happened to be underway. Perseus, travelling separately and with no knowledge that his own grandfather had fled to that exact same city, arrived at Larissa as well, and it is worth pausing on the particular, almost unbearable irony of what happened next, because Perseus, competing in the very same games, threw a discus that veered off its own intended course, carried astray by a sudden gust of wind in most tellings, and struck an elderly spectator standing among the crowd, killing him instantly, and it was only afterward, once the body had been examined and identified, that Perseus learned the man he had just killed, entirely by accident, and with no possible way of having known who stood among that watching crowd, was his own grandfather Acrisius, the very man whose own fear of exactly this outcome had shaped the whole of Perseus's own life from before he had even been born. It is worth pausing on what that single accident actually tells us about the nature of prophecy across this entire broader tradition, a lesson this channel has already named once before in the story of Zeus's own rise to kingship, that these old oracles almost never miss their mark no matter how carefully a frightened father or grandfather tries to outrun them. And it is worth sitting too with the particular cruelty of how this one specific prophecy actually came true, not through any act of ambition or rebellion on Perseus's own part, not through any desire of his own to claim his grandfather's throne or settle any old grievance, but through a simple accident of wind and aim that neither one of them could have possibly foreseen or prevented, a fulfillment this story frames as entirely blameless on Perseus's own part and, in its own way, considerably sadder for exactly that reason, because it means Acrisius's whole lifetime of fear and precaution accomplished nothing at all except guaranteeing that the two of them would never have any chance to know each other before the exact fate he had spent that lifetime trying to avoid finally, quietly, and entirely by accident found him anyway. Perseus, grief-stricken and unwilling, even with the throne of Argos now legally his own by right of inheritance, to rule over a city where his own grandfather's death would follow him into every single council and every single public appearance for the rest of his own reign, chose instead to trade kingdoms with a cousin named Megapenthes, taking for himself the smaller city of Tiryns and, in several tellings, going on to found the great city of Mycenae as well, a city whose own name and whose own massive stone walls would go on, across the centuries that followed, to become synonymous with an entire age of Greek civilization this channel may well explore in full on some other night. It is worth pausing on one small, lasting piece of Perseus's own legacy, still visible in the actual archaeological remains of that same city today, because when later Greeks, living many centuries after Mycenae's own great walls were first raised, looked up at the sheer size of the individual stone blocks fitted together to build them, some of them weighing many tons apiece and stacked without any mortar at all, they found the whole thing frankly impossible to credit to ordinary human labour, and concluded instead that only the Cyclopes, the very same one-eyed craftsman this channel has already followed across the story of Zeus, could possibly have built something so massive, giving us the term Cyclopean masonry, still used today by archaeologists and architectural historians to describe any wall built from enormous, roughly fitted stone blocks, a term that survives in ordinary scholarly use entirely because an ancient people looking at their own ancestors' genuine engineering skill simply could not quite believe a mortal hand had done it. It is worth naming too that the single most famous surviving entrance into that same city, a massive gateway still standing today above two great relief-carved lionesses flanking a central column, has been known since antiquity simply as the Lion Gate, and that any traveller visiting the actual ruins of Mycenae today can still walk beneath that exact same stone lintel, carved and set in place somewhere around the 13th century before Christ, considerably closer in time to whatever real historical kernel this whole legendary city may once have been built around than to Ovid or Hesiod or any of the poets who eventually told its founder's own story. It is worth pausing too one final time on Perseus's own eventual death, because this story rarely gets told in as much detail as everything leading up to it, and it is worth naming honestly what little the old sources actually tell us. Perseus and Andromeda are said, in most tellings, to have lived out a long and largely peaceful reign together, raising several children who would go on to found their own smaller kingdoms and their own noble houses across the wider Greek world, and it is worth naming, briefly, that one of their own daughters was given a name that tells us exactly how central this whole night story remained to her own father's identity for the rest of his life. Gorgophone, meaning quite literally Gorgon Slayer, a daughter who grew up carrying in her own everyday name the single most famous act her own father ever committed, spoken aloud by everyone who ever addressed her for the whole of her own life afterward, and upon his own eventual death, Perseus was said to have been placed among the stars himself, exactly as this telling has already described happening to Andromeda and to her own parents, joining the very same small permanent constellation of family and monster and rescued bride that this whole episode left scattered across the night sky. A quiet, ordinary ending, by the standards of everything else this story has already shown us, for a hero whose own most famous single act was carried out in total silence, against a sleeping woman who never once had the chance to fight back. It is worth pausing briefly on what became of Danae herself once her own son had finally settled into his own kingdom, because the old sources characteristically tell us remarkably little, content simply to let her own story fade quietly out of the foreground once the danger threatening her had finally passed. She's not recorded as ruling anywhere in her own right, nor as ever returning to Argos, the city her own father had once tried so completely to keep her from ever leaving, and it is worth sitting one final time with how ordinary and how unglamorous that ending actually is set beside everything else this story has already put her through. A woman who survived a bronze prison, an open sea, and years spent shielding her own son from a king's own unwanted attention, allowed at last, once the story no longer strictly needed her, simply to disappear quietly into whatever ordinary peace her own son's new household could finally offer her. It is worth naming too one final thread connecting this whole story directly back to a hero. This channel's listeners have already spent an entire earlier night within this very room, because Perseus and Andromeda's own descendants would go on, across the generations that followed, to include a woman named Alcmene, whom this channel has already described, in the story of Heracles being visited by Zeus in the guise of her own husband, and bearing, from that union, the single greatest hero the whole of Greek mythology ever produced, meaning that Perseus, the young man who beheaded a sleeping woman at the edge of the world in tonight's own story, was, by the plain arithmetic of this tradition's own family trees, Heracles' own great-grandfather, one more quiet thread linking nearly every story this channel has ever told in this room back into a single, sprawling, endlessly intermarried family. It is worth pausing, before we move any further, on how much of this entire story, once you actually trace it back through, turned not on any deliberate choice at all, but on plain, unweighted chance. Because this whole tradition, across every single telling this channel has ever brought into this room, keeps returning to that same uncomfortable truth, that the gap between a story remembered as triumph and a story remembered as tragedy is very often no wider than a single gust of wind, or a single moment's own bad timing. Consider how much of tonight's own story could easily have gone an entirely different way. If the wind over that funeral games in Larissa had shifted only slightly, Perseus' own discus lands harmlessly in open ground. Acrisius lives out his own remaining years in quiet, watchful exile, and an entire prophecy this whole story has been carrying since before Perseus was even born simply expires unfulfilled, its own warning proven in the end to have been nothing more than an old man's needless fear. If Cassiopeia had simply kept her own boast to herself, or made it quietly enough that no passing Nereid ever carried word of it back to the sea, Andromeda spent her whole life on dry land, married to whichever suitor her own father originally intended, and Perseus, flying home from the Gorgon's cave with nothing more than a severed head in his own pouch, never once meets the woman this whole tradition would go on to remember as his own wife. If Perseus himself had simply declined Polydectes' own challenge at that fateful feast, swallowed his own wounded pride and offered some ordinary gift of his own instead, there is no quest to tell at all tonight. No cave, no shield, no field of statues, only an ordinary young fisherman's own adopted son living out an ordinary and entirely unremarkable life on a small and unremarkable island. It is worth sitting with how little of this entire story, held up honestly against itself, was actually inevitable, because it means the version of events this whole tradition eventually settled on, and retold for 3,000 years afterward, was never the only version that could have happened, but simply the one version that did, preserved and repeated, and eventually carved into temple pediments and cast into Florentine bronze, not because it was somehow fated to occur exactly this way, but because it was the version that actually unfolded out of an enormous unrecorded field of quieter, less dramatic possibilities that simply never came to pass. And it is worth naming too that this same contingency runs in the opposite direction as well, back towards Medusa's own life before Perseus ever set out looking for her, because if Poseidon had simply never entered that particular temple on that particular afternoon, there is no serpent-haired monster for this whole tradition to remember at all, only a priestess who lived out her own long service to a goddess she believed, right up until the day everything changed, was actually watching over her. Let us pause now, before we move into the final sections of tonight's own telling, on where exactly all of these details actually come from. Because this whole story, true to the honest habit this channel has already shown you in every other night we have spent together in this room, was never handed down to us whole and complete from any single ancient source, but was assembled, piece by piece and century by century, out of a whole scattered library of poets and playwrights and mythographers who did not always agree with one another, and who were, in more than one case, writing many hundreds of years apart from each other about events none of them could have actually witnessed. The very oldest reference to Medusa's own existence anywhere in the surviving Greek record does not actually come from Hesiod's Theogony at all, though that remains our oldest full account of her family and her own basic nature, but from Homer himself in the Iliad, the same epic this channel has already followed across an entire earlier night in this room, where the Gorgon's own terrible face is mentioned twice, once decorating the aegis Athena herself wears into battle, and once decorating the shield of the mortal warrior Agamemnon, meaning that the image of a monstrous protective face repelling enemies through pure terror was already a familiar and established piece of the Greek imagination by the time Homer's own epics were first composed, likely sometime in the 8th century before Christ, roughly the same period Hesiod himself was writing, well before any full narrative account of how that face actually came to exist on those shields had ever been written down at all. It is worth pausing too on a genuine tension running underneath all of these written sources, because the visual record this telling has already described tonight, the running Gorgon painted onto archaic pottery, the tusked and grimacing face carved onto temple pediments and grave markers, appears to establish Medusa's own basic monstrous image in Greek art considerably earlier and considerably more consistently than any surviving written poem bothers to describe her in comparable physical detail, meaning our clearest picture of how ordinary ancient Greeks actually imagined her face may come to us less from any single poet's own careful description at all, and more from the accumulated, largely anonymous evidence of many hundreds of separate craftsmen who never once wrote down why they kept reaching for the exact same tusked, wide-eyed image across so many separate generations. Hesiod's own Theogony, composed in that same general period, gives us our first connected account of the Gorgon sisters' own family and their basic nature. Mortal Medusa among two immortal sisters, born of Phorcys and Ceto, killed eventually by Perseus, with Pegasus and Chrysaea springing from her severed neck. But Hesiod's own account remains genuinely brief, more interested in placing the Gorgons correctly within the wider family tree of the gods than in telling their story at any real length, and it is worth pausing on how much of the fuller narrative this telling has already walked through tonight. The grey, the magical equipment, Atlas, Andromeda, actually comes from considerably later sources rather than from Hesiod himself at all. It was Pindar, the great lyric poet of the 5th century before Christ, who gives us, in his own 12th Pythian ode, one of the most beautiful small details this entire tradition ever attached to Medusa's own story, the invention of the aulos, the double reed pipe this telling named earlier tonight, said to have been crafted by Athena herself in a direct and deliberate attempt to reproduce, in music, the exact sound of Stheno and Uriel's own grief-stricken wailing after their sister's death. A detail worth pausing on again here because it means at least one strand of this ancient tradition wanted its audience to remember Medusa's own death not simply as a triumph worth celebrating, but as a genuine and lasting grief, mournful enough that an entire musical instrument was invented specifically to help the living world carry some small echo of it forward. It is worth naming, too, one further and considerably darker thread. This same small invention eventually pulled into this whole broader tradition, because Athena herself, several later sources tell us, abandoned the aulos almost as soon as she had finished crafting it, catching sight of her own reflection in a still pool of water while she played, and discovering that the instrument's own demanding, cheek-swelling technique distorted her face into something she found genuinely unbecoming for a goddess of her own dignity, and cast the instrument aside in disgust. It was picked up in the story's own next turn by a satyr named Marsyas, who mastered it so completely that he grew bold enough to challenge the god Apollo himself to a musical contest, a contest Marsyas lost, and paid for with a punishment this tradition remembers as one of its own cruelest, flayed alive for the presumption of ever believing a satyr's own borrowed skill could rival a god's. It is worth sitting with how strange and how quietly consistent it actually is that an instrument first crafted specifically to mourn one wronged figure's own suffering should go on, only a few tellings later, to become the direct cause of an entirely different and equally brutal punishment visited on whoever next dared to pick it up, as though this whole tradition simply could not resist letting even its gentlest gestures of grief eventually curdle back into another story about power answered with violence. It was a considerably later work, the Bibliotheca or library traditionally, and almost certainly wrongly, attributed to a scholar named Apollodorus, compiled sometime in the 1st or 2nd century after Christ. This same channel has already named, in the earlier telling of Zeus's own story, as the single most systematic attempt the ancient world ever made to gather every competing version of these old myths into one connected reference that gives us the fullest and most detailed connected narrative of Perseus's own entire quest. The grey, the nymphs, the specific equipment, Atlas, Andromeda, Phineus, and the eventual death of Acrisius, all woven together into the single continuous story this telling has largely followed tonight, and it is worth remembering honestly, exactly as this channel reminded you during the story of Zeus, that a source written a full 1,000 years after the events it describes were first imagined is not quite the same kind of witness as an eyewitness account of anything that actually happened, especially since nothing in tonight's own story ever actually happened in the way a real historical battle or a real historical journey did. And it was Ovid, writing in Latin for a Roman audience at the very turn of the 1st century after Christ, who gives us the single strand of this whole story most modern listeners actually associate with Medusa's own name above every other, the beautiful priestess, the temple, Poseidon's assault, and Athena's own transformation of her hair into serpents, a version this telling has already named, at real length, as arriving considerably later than nearly every other piece of this story and preserved, so far as any source now surviving can tell us, in no earlier Greek text at all, meaning we genuinely do not know, and cannot know with any real confidence, whether Ovid was recording an older oral tradition that simply never survived in writing before his own lifetime, or composing, largely out of his own considerable imagination, the version of this story that would go on to eclipse nearly everything that came before it. It is worth naming too one further and considerably more grounded kind of source this whole story rests on, because a Greek travel writer named Pausanias, the same careful, curious eyewitness this channel has already credited in the story of Zeus, with recording so much of what we actually know about the physical religious sites connected to that earlier telling, also recorded in his own 2nd century description of Greece, several actual temples and shrines connected to the Gorgon myth, as he himself found them still standing in his own lifetime, and it is worth being grateful, once again, for a writer who cared enough to walk the actual ground these old stories were told about, and write down what remained of it there, because without his own patient record, considerably more of what this channel can tell you about the real, physical afterlife of this particular myth would rest on nothing firmer than a poem's own say-so. It is worth naming too that the great Athenian tragedians, working in the 5th century before Christ, in the same golden age of theatre this channel has already touched on when describing Prometheus's own suffering in the story of Zeus, reached for Gorgon imagery again and again as a kind of shorthand for pure, overwhelming dread. Aeschylus himself, in his own tragedy Prometheus Bound, having the chained Titan warn a passing traveller of the Gorgons and of their sisters, the Grey still waiting somewhere out at the edge of the known world. A brief mention that tells us this whole family of monstrous women had, by the 5th century before Christ, already become familiar enough to an ordinary Athenian theatre audience that a playwright could simply name them in passing, trusting his own audience to understand exactly what kind of terror he meant without needing to explain any further. It is worth naming too that at least one entire epic poem devoted specifically to Perseus's own adventures, referred to by later ancient writers under a title usually translated as the Perseus, seems to have existed at some point in this tradition's own long history, composed by a poet whose own name and whose own century have not survived alongside the handful of second-hand references to his work. One more entry, in a night already full of them, in the long list of ancient poems this tradition once possessed and has since entirely lost, leaving us, once again, to reconstruct as much of the fuller story as we can from later prose summaries and from the scattered second-hand fragments that happen to survive by being quoted inside someone else's later, surviving book. It is worth being honest, one final time, that a great deal of what actually made Medusa's own story so widely and so consistently recognisable across the whole of the ancient Mediterranean world almost certainly circulated for generations in an oral storytelling tradition. This channel has no direct written access to it at all. Mothers and grandmothers and travelling singers telling their own versions of this same story around countless hearths. This whole historical record was never actually built to preserve, meaning every single written source this telling has named tonight, however old or however carefully researched, is still only ever a single frozen snapshot of a story that was, for most of its own actual life, alive and shifting, and told slightly differently in every single household that ever passed it on. A goddess who both made her and unmade her, and a fairness this story refuses to resolve. It is worth pausing before we move into the final sections of tonight's telling on Athena's own particular and genuinely uncomfortable position across the whole of this story, because no other single figure appears on both sides of Medusa's own fate quite the way she does, present in Ovid's own telling as the one who transformed her into a monster in the first place, and present again in nearly every telling of Perseus's own quest, as the goddess who made that same monster's death possible, and who received her own severed head as a permanent trophy once the killing was finally done. It is worth pausing too on one further and considerably more specific piece of Athena's own character that this same tradition consistently gives her, because she was worshipped across the whole of the ancient Greek world as a virgin goddess, her own chastity understood as a fixed and essential part of who she actually was, no less central to her own identity than her wisdom or her skill in war, and it is worth wondering honestly whether that specific detail actually deepens rather than resolves the discomfort this story has already asked you to sit with. Because a goddess whose own entire cult was built in part around the sanctity of her own untouched body may have experienced the violation of her own temple by exactly the kind of assault her own worshippers most feared for themselves, as something considerably more personal and considerably more threatening than an ordinary act of ritual pollution alone. A reading this telling cannot confirm from any surviving ancient source, but one worth naming honestly regardless, because it offers at least one further, more sympathetic thread through which an ancient audience might have understood her own reaction, however unfair that reaction still looks when measured against Medusa's own complete innocence in the matter. It is worth holding both hands open here, exactly as this channel has tried to do across every other night we have spent together in this room, because there is a genuine case to be made on Athena's own behalf that this whole tradition rarely bothers to make as clearly as it probably should. Athena, across nearly every other story this channel has ever told involving her, appears as one of the most consistently thoughtful and consistently protective figures in the entire Greek pantheon. A goddess of strategic wisdom rather than mindless violence, a steady and reliable ally to countless mortal heroes across the whole of this tradition's storytelling, and it is worth remembering that the ancient world she belonged to understood ritual pollution, the miasma this telling described earlier tonight, as something closer to a literal, almost physical contamination than to any modern notion of moral blame, meaning an ancient audience hearing Ovid's own version of this story may not have understood Athena's transformation of Medusa as a punishment for any personal fault at all, but as a genuinely difficult, almost mechanical response to an act of defilement that had to be answered somehow, however unfair that answer looks to modern eyes raised on an entirely different understanding of consent and blame. And yet it is worth naming, with equal honesty, that this same explanation, however faithfully it may reflect the actual religious framework of the ancient world that first told this story, does not erase the plain fact that Athena had another available target entirely, a fellow Olympian whose own actions had actually caused the pollution in the first place, and chose, whatever her own reasoning, to direct the entire weight of her response toward the party with the least power to resist it. It is worth sitting, honestly, with the fact that this same pattern, a wronged woman answered with punishment rather than protection, while the more powerful party responsible for the original harm faces no consequence at all, is not unique to Athena within this broader tradition, and it is worth naming plainly that this pattern has felt, to a great many readers across a great many centuries since, uncomfortably familiar in ways that reach well beyond the boundaries of any single ancient myth. A discomfort this telling is not going to resolve into any tidy verdict on Athena's own character, because the ancient sources themselves across every single version we have described tonight never resolve it either, choosing instead to let her stand across this entire story as both Medusa's maker and her destroyer's own guiding hand, two roles this tradition apparently found no particular need to reconcile. It is worth pausing too, before we move any further, on Poseidon's own place in this whole accounting, because it would be dishonest to spend this much of tonight's telling weighing Athena's own complicated role so carefully, and simply let the god actually responsible for the original violence pass by entirely unexamined. Poseidon, across the whole of the wider Greek tradition, was never a god this culture treated as a simple villain, worshipped seriously and sincerely in his own right across the whole of the ancient Greek world, credited with the safety of every sailor who ever trusted a ship to his own waters, and it would be a genuine distortion of how an ancient audience actually understood him to imagine them hearing Ovid's own story of Medusa and immediately recasting their own sea god as some kind of straightforward monster. And yet it is worth naming with equal honesty that this same pattern, a god of enormous power pursuing a mortal woman with no real regard for her own consent and facing no lasting consequence whatsoever for it afterward, is not unique to Medusa's own story within this wider tradition at all, since this channel has already shown you, in the story of Zeus, an entire catalogue of mortal women pursued in broadly similar terms, and it is worth sitting, honestly, with how rarely this whole tradition, across any of these stories, actually asks its own gods to reckon with the lasting cost of what they wanted, reserving nearly all of that reckoning instead for the mortal women who happened to be standing nearest when the wanting arrived. A face the whole ancient world reached for, and echoes this story never quite claims to fully explain. It is worth pausing, before we return to Medusa's own story one final time, on how far beyond the borders of Greece itself this particular image, a monstrous protective face meant to ward off danger through pure terror, actually reaches, because the Gorgon was never entirely alone in the ancient imagination, and it is worth naming a few of the wider parallels honestly, in the same spirit of careful, hedged comparison this channel has already used, in the story of Zeus, when setting the Greek creation myths beside the Babylonian and Hittite traditions that so closely resemble them. In the much older Mesopotamian tradition preserved in the Epic of Gilgamesh, a monstrous guardian named Humbaba, appointed by the gods to protect the sacred cedar forest, was said to possess a face so terrifying that its very image, carved onto small clay plaques and hung in ordinary households, was believed to ward off evil and misfortune from anyone who kept it close. A use of a monster's own frightening face as a tool of everyday household protection that echoes, in its own distant and independently developed way, exactly the same instinct that would eventually place the Gorgonean above so many Greek doorways centuries later, and it is worth naming honestly that this channel does not know, and no scholar now living can know with any real certainty, whether any direct contact or borrowing ever passed between these two separate traditions, since the distances and the centuries involved make that kind of claim impossible to support responsibly. But the pattern itself, a monstrous face repurposed as protection rather than simply feared as a threat, is worth noticing regardless, because it suggests this particular instinct, using terror itself as a kind of shield, may be one of the oldest and most widely shared responses the human imagination has ever developed to the plane, universal fear of misfortune arriving uninvited at your own door. It is worth naming, too, a figure from an entirely different and considerably closer ancient neighbour, because the Egyptian household deity Bes, worshipped across the whole of ancient Egypt for thousands of years before Medusa's own story was ever first told, and worshipped still, in various forms, well into the period of Greek and later Roman contact with Egypt, was depicted consistently as a squat, grotesque, wide-mouthed dwarf, deliberately hideous by any conventional ancient standard of beauty, and deployed across an enormous range of ordinary Egyptian households specifically to protect women in childbirth and to ward off evil spirits from the home, his own frightening face doing exactly the same protective work this telling has already described Medusa's own face performing for grieving families and expectant mothers alike across the Greek world many centuries later. It is worth naming, honestly, that trade and cultural contact between Egypt and the Greek world was extensive enough across this whole period that some scholars have wondered whether images like Bes may have influenced the earliest Greek development of apotropaic monster faces, including the Gorgonean itself, though this telling wants to be equally honest that this remains a genuinely open and unsettled question among the historians who study it, impossible to prove with any real confidence given how many centuries and how many separate cultures actually stand between the two traditions. It is worth naming, too, one further and considerably more distant comparison. Reaching well beyond the Mediterranean world, this telling has otherwise confined itself to tonight, because the Hindu goddess Kali, worshipped across an entirely separate religious tradition, with its own considerably older and considerably more elaborate theology, is depicted in a great deal of surviving devotional art with a wild, unbound mane, a fierce and often tongue-bearing expression, and a role that similarly combines destruction with genuine protection. Worshipped by millions of devotees today not despite her own terrifying appearance but very much because of it, understood as a fierce mother who destroys evil and illusion rather than as any simple villain. It is worth naming, with the same honesty this telling has already applied to every other comparison tonight, that this channel is not claiming any historical connection whatsoever between these two entirely separate traditions, developed independently by civilizations that had, so far as any surviving evidence tells us, no meaningful contact with one another across the whole of the period. Both traditions were actually forming, but the deeper pattern is worth sitting with regardless. A fierce, unsettling feminine face reaching across two civilizations that never met, toward roughly the same paradox, terror repurposed as protection, horror pressed into service as a guardian rather than simply feared as an ending. It is worth naming, too, a considerably wider and more loosely connected tradition of apotropaic imagery, protective symbols meant specifically to turn evil away, rather than to depict any particular narrative at all, that appears across an enormous range of cultures, bordering the ancient Mediterranean and reaching well beyond it. Wide, staring eyes painted onto the prows of ships, grotesque and exaggerated faces carved above the doorways of homes and temples alike, a broad, shared human tendency. This telling is not going to claim any single unified origin for, but one worth sitting with regardless, because it means the particular use this tradition eventually found for Medusa's own face, mounted onto Athena's own shield and reproduced endlessly afterward as a symbol of protection rather than of pure destruction, was never actually a strange or unprecedented choice within the wider ancient world, but one small, specifically Greek expression of an instinct that seems to have arisen, independently and repeatedly, almost everywhere human beings have ever built a doorway they wanted to keep safe. It is worth pausing before we turn to the grand temples and the famous statues this story eventually produced, on how thoroughly ordinary and how thoroughly everyday Medusa's own face actually became across the whole of ancient Greek and later Roman daily life, because the Gorgonian was never reserved only for the largest and most sacred buildings a city could construct. Ordinary Greek roof tiles, the small triangular antefixes that cap the edges of an ordinary temple or an ordinary wealthy household's own roofline, were very often moulded with a small Gorgon face staring outward, a household's own quiet insurance against whatever misfortune might otherwise have found its way down through the rafters. Shields carried into battle by ordinary hoplite soldiers, men who could never have afforded a bronze mirror shield of the kind Athena gave to Perseus, were frequently painted or embossed with a Gorgon's own face at their centre. Cheap and widely available way for an ordinary foot soldier to carry at least a little of that same protective terror into whatever battle he was about to fight. Coins minted across dozens of separate Greek city-states, most famously in the wealthy trading city of Neapolis and in several cities on the island of Sicily, stamped Medusa's own face directly onto the currency their own citizens carried in their pockets every single day, meaning an ordinary Greek buying bread or paying a debt in the marketplace might very well have handled her image without a second thought several times before the sun had even properly finished setting. It is worth sitting with how strange that casual, everyday familiarity actually is, set beside everything else this story has already asked us to feel about her. A face representing, in one entire strand of this tradition, one of the ancient world's clearest surviving depictions of an assaulted and unjustly punished woman, worn instead by the ordinary citizens who carried her image every day as nothing more than a familiar and comforting piece of household and civic protection, rarely if ever connected, in any ordinary person's daily thinking, back to the actual grief her own story was built around. It is worth pausing too on one particular and rather poignant corner of that everyday use, because small Gorgon-faced amulets, carved from bone or cast in cheap bronze, have been recovered by modern archaeologists from burial sites and household remains right across the ancient Greek and later Roman world. and it is worth naming honestly that we cannot always know, this many centuries removed, exactly which fears each individual amulet was actually meant to ward off. But a considerable body of evidence connects imagery very much, like the Gorgonian, to protection specifically sought by women during pregnancy and childbirth, a period the ancient world understood, correctly enough by its own medical standards, to be genuinely dangerous and warded, by whatever means were available, against the evil eye and against the countless unnamed dangers believed to hover around a woman and a newborn child in the days surrounding a birth. It is worth sitting with the quiet, considerable irony of that particular use, because it means an ordinary Greek mother sometime in the centuries following this story's first telling may well have worn or kept near her own body, during the single most vulnerable physical experience of her own life, the very face of a woman whose own life had once been irrevocably altered, in one whole strand of this tradition, by a god's assault and a goddess's unjust punishment, an ancient mother reaching, quite without knowing it, for the protection of another woman's own worst suffering, worn now as a shield rather than remembered as a wound. And it is worth wondering, honestly, whether Medusa herself, whichever version of her own story you find truest tonight, would have wanted to be remembered that way at all, or whether she might have preferred, given any choice in the matter whatsoever, simply to have been left alone. A stone Gorgon still standing on a Greek island, and a shield in a Florence square that has stood there since before the modern world properly began. It is worth pausing now, before we let ourselves drift into this story's own final reflections, on the traces this whole ancient story has actually left behind in the physical world. Because Medusa's own image did not simply fade away once the last worshippers, who genuinely believed in her power, finally stopped believing, but has continued across nearly 3,000 years since to be carved and painted and cast in bronze, by artists who understood her, by their own lifetimes, as pure legend rather than any living religious threat, and yet who kept returning to her face regardless, again and again, as though something about it had never actually stopped being useful to say. It is worth pausing, too, on a single word this whole episode left behind in a great many modern languages, because the goatskin shield Athena carried Medusa's own face upon, the aegis this telling named earlier tonight, survives today in ordinary English usage, in the phrase under the aegis of, meaning under the protection or the authority of someone more powerful, a phrase used constantly in modern boardrooms and modern government offices by speakers who, in the overwhelming majority of cases, have no idea they are invoking, every time they use it, a shield bearing a murdered woman's severed head. It is worth sitting with that particular piece of linguistic drift for a moment, because it means the word survived and travelled across nearly 3,000 years, while the actual specific image it was born from, protection built directly out of someone else's suffering, fell away almost entirely from ordinary memory, carried forward now by nothing more than the bare, hollowed-out shell of a word that used to mean something considerably more specific and considerably more uncomfortable than mere general safety. On the island of Corfu, off the western coast of modern Greece, the ruins of an ancient temple dedicated to the goddess Artemis still stand today, and it is worth pausing on what remains of that temple's own western pediment, because it holds one of the largest and best preserved pieces of archaic Greek architectural sculpture anywhere in the ancient world, a massive, wide-eyed, tusked Gorgon face, carved directly into the stone at the very centre of the whole composition, flanked by great stone panthers on either side, dating back to somewhere around the early 6th century before Christ, meaning this single carved face has been standing, in one form or another, watching out over that same stretch of Greek coastline for roughly 2,500 years, considerably longer than any other single image from tonight's entire story has managed to survive intact, and it is worth naming that this actual carved pediment can still be seen today, preserved now in the Archaeological Museum of Corfu by any traveller who happens to find themselves on that particular island, with an afternoon free to spend among considerably older company than they might otherwise have expected. It's worth naming, too, that Corfu's own temple was never the only ancient building to place her face at the very heart of its own construction, because the Greek colonies of Sicily, a considerable distance across the sea from mainland Greece itself, produce some of the most striking surviving examples of this same architectural habit. The ancient city of Selinunte, in particular preserving, among the ruins of its own several temples, more than one carved metope, a rectangular relief panel set into a temple's own frieze, depicting Perseus in the very act of beheading her, Athena standing close, at his own shoulder, exactly as this telling has already described her. These same carved stone panels, recovered by archaeologists in the modern era, are now housed in the Regional Archaeological Museum in the city of Palermo, where any traveller curious enough to seek them out can still stand today in front of stone that ancient Sicilian worshippers once carved and prayed beneath. It is worth pausing on how far this single image actually travelled. From the Greek mainland outward across the whole of the Mediterranean colonial world, appearing on temples separated from each other by hundreds of miles of open sea, a single, wronged, monstrous face reproduced, generation after generation, by an entire civilization that never seemed to tire of carving it. It is worth naming, too, a considerably later and considerably more famous piece of art connected to this same story, because in the city of Florence, in the open-air gallery of statues known as the Loggia dei Lanzi, standing at the edge of the Piazza della Signoria, a bronze statue by the sculptor Benvenuto Cellini, completed in the middle of the 16th century, still stands today depicting the exact moment this telling, described many hours ago tonight, Perseus, triumphant, holding Medusa's own severed head aloft in one hand, while her headless body lies crumpled beneath his own feet, a statue considered, by nearly every serious historian of Renaissance sculpture, one of the single finest bronze works the whole of that era ever produced. And it is worth pausing on the fact that visitors to that same square today, wandering past it on their way to any number of the city's other famous sites, are looking at an image of this exact story, cast in solid bronze, that has now been standing in that exact spot for very nearly 500 years. It is worth naming, too, that this same story was already being painted onto the walls of ordinary Roman households many centuries before either Cellini or Caravaggio ever picked up a chisel or a brush, because the city of Pompeii, buried and preserved almost perfectly intact by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in the year 79 after Christ, has yielded, among its own countless preserved wall paintings, more than one surviving fresco depicting Perseus and Andromeda together, painted directly onto the plaster walls of ordinary private homes by artists working in a decorative style fashionable across the whole of the Roman world at exactly that moment, meaning that an ordinary Roman family, sitting down to dinner in their own home on the very last ordinary evening before the volcano finally buried their entire city, may well have looked up, without giving it any particular thought at all, at a chained princess and her own approaching rescuer painted directly onto their own dining room wall, a scene that has now survived, entombed beneath ash and pumice, for very nearly 2,000 years longer than the family who first commissioned it. It is worth naming, too, a painting by an entirely different and considerably more famous artist, because the Italian painter Caravaggio, working at the very end of the 16th century, produced a striking image of Medusa's own severed head, mouth open in a final scream, painted directly onto a ceremonial shield rather than any ordinary canvas, a work that hangs today in the Uffizi Gallery in Florence, not far at all from Cellini's own bronze statue standing in the square outside, and it is worth sitting with the strange, quiet fact that a single city in modern Italy still holds, within easy walking distance of each other, two of the most celebrated artistic depictions this entire 3,000-year-old story has ever produced. It is worth naming, too, one further sculptural tradition connected to her own face, because the great Baroque sculptor Gian Lorenzo Bernini, working in Rome in the middle of the 17th century, carved his own marble bust of Medusa at what art historians generally believe was the very moment of her own transformation, her face still caught between the two states this whole night has spent so long describing, human anguish still visible beneath features already beginning to harden into something else, a bust that survives today in the collection of the Capitoline Museums in Rome. And it is worth pausing on the fact that Bernini, working entirely within a Christian 17th century Rome many centuries removed from the ancient Mediterranean world that first told this story, still chose to capture her not as a finished monster at all, but as a woman frozen mid-transformation, suffering visibly in the very stone meant to represent the exact moment her own suffering was about to become permanently unreadable to anyone looking at her afterward. And it is worth naming finally how thoroughly this particular myth has continued to seep into corners of the modern world that have nothing at all to do with ancient temples or Renaissance sculpture gardens. The scientific name given to an entire order of extinct saber-toothed predators that once ruled the world during the Permian period, hundreds of millions of years before any dinosaur ever walked the earth, is Gorgonopsia, meaning quite literally Gorgon-faced, a name chosen by the paleontologists who first described these creatures, specifically because their own broad, fanged skulls reminded them of exactly the kind of terrifying face this whole story has spent tonight describing. Modern medicine, too, borrowed her name directly, giving the term caput Medusae, meaning Medusa's head, to a specific and genuinely striking medical condition, in which the veins radiating outward from a patient's own navel become visibly distended and snake-like, a direct physical echo. This same tradition apparently still felt worth reaching for even in an examining room, of the exact image this whole story has been describing all night long. Astronomers named an enormous, faint, filament-streaked cloud of gas drifting through deep space the Medusa Nebula, its own wispy tendrils of glowing matter, resembling to whoever first mapped it nothing so much as a great head of writhing hair, and the modern Italian fashion house founded by the designer Gianni Versace adopted her own face as its central emblem, stamped today onto handbags and belt buckles and storefronts across nearly every major city in the world, worn, this telling suspects, by a great many people who could not actually tell you, if you asked them directly, why exactly that particular face was chosen at all. It is worth naming too that her own face still flies today, quite literally, above an entire modern Italian region, because the official flag and emblem of Sicily, the same island whose own ancient temples this telling has already named tonight, still carries at its own centre an ancient symbol called the Trinacria, a winged, serpent-haired head, unmistakably descended from the Gorgonion this whole night, has spent so long describing, with three bent legs radiating outward from it, representing the island's own three ancient headlands, a symbol first adopted by the Greek colonists who settled that island many centuries before Christ and never actually abandoned since, meaning that any visitor driving across modern Sicily today, passing a provincial government building or glancing at a car's own license plate, is very likely looking, without any particular occasion to think twice about it, at a lineal descendant of the exact same wronged and monstrous face this whole story has spent tonight trying to understand. It is worth naming, too, one final and considerably more direct piece of her own scientific legacy, because when the 18th century Swedish naturalist Carl Linnaeus set out to formally classify the whole of the animal kingdom, establishing the very system of naming still used by biologists today, he reached directly for Medusa's own name to describe an entire class of free-swimming, tentacled sea creatures, the bell-shaped, trailing-armed life stage of what we still call, in ordinary conversation today, a jellyfish, naming it Medusa specifically because its own drifting, wavering tendrils reminded him, examining specimens pulled up from the sea 2,500 years after her own story was first told, of nothing so much as a head of living, moving serpents, meaning that unlike the word petrify, which merely echoes her general reputation without any true and direct historical connection, or the phrase under the aegis of, which has drifted so far from its own origin that almost no one using it remembers her at all. The actual scientific name for an entire form of marine life still carries her own name forward, deliberately and explicitly, every single time a biologist anywhere in the world writes it down. It is worth pausing, too, on one final and considerably less flattering piece of Medusa's own modern afterlife, because the plain English word Gorgon, borrowed directly from her own family name, settled over the centuries into ordinary usage as a term for a fierce, domineering, and specifically older woman, a stern schoolteacher, or a disapproving mother-in-law, deployed almost exclusively across the whole of its own modern usage, as an insult aimed at women whose only actual crime was refusing to be quiet or agreeable. And it is worth sitting with the particular quiet irony of that linguistic afterlife, because it means the exact same pattern. This whole story has already asked you to notice inside the ancient myth itself a wronged or simply assertive woman relabelled, without her own consent, as something monstrous, somehow survived the fall of the entire civilization that first told her story and slipped quietly into the everyday vocabulary of languages that came many centuries after it, still doing, in ordinary conversation today, more or less exactly the same work it was already doing on that temple floor 3,000 years ago. A woman's rage, finally allowed to speak for itself. It is worth pausing before we let this whole long night finally draw toward its own quiet close, on how differently the modern world has actually chosen to look back at this same ancient story. Because the last several decades in particular have seen a genuine and deliberate effort, across literature and art alike, to retell Medusa's own story not as a cautionary tale about monstrous punishment at all, but as a story about survival and about a rage this tradition rarely let its own women voice directly for themselves. It is worth pausing, before we reach that more recent reclamation, on one earlier and considerably stranger chapter of Medusa's own modern afterlife, because in the early 1920s the Austrian founder of psychoanalysis, Sigmund Freud, wrote a short unfinished essay that took her own severed head as its central image, arguing in his own particular theoretical language that the sight of the Gorgon's face represented a deeply buried fear connected to the female body itself, and that the snakes crowning her own head functioned, in his own reading, as a kind of symbolic multiplication standing in for an anxiety he believed sat at the very root of a great deal of human psychology. It is worth naming this essay honestly, rather than either dismissing it outright or repeating its own specific claims as though they were simple established fact, because Freud's own theories about this particular myth have been extensively challenged and revised by later scholars, including a great many feminist theorists who found his own reading considerably more revealing of his own era's particular anxieties than of anything the ancient Greeks themselves actually intended. But it is worth sitting with the plain fact of his own essay's existence regardless, because it means Medusa's own face had, by the early 20th century, already become significant enough within the wider culture of the Western world that one of that century's single most influential thinkers felt compelled to write about her, however strangely, entirely on his own century's own terms, rather than on the terms of the ancient poets who first gave her that face at all. In the year 1975, the French writer Hélène Cixous published an influential essay that took Medusa's own name and her own image directly as its title, arguing, in effect, that the horror this figure had been made to represent for so many centuries said considerably more about the fear of those looking at her than it ever said about anything monstrous actually residing within her, an argument that would go on, across the decades that followed, to shape a great deal of later feminist thought and later feminist art built around reclaiming exactly this same figure. And it is worth naming too a considerably more recent and considerably more physical piece of that same reclamation, because in the year 2008, an Argentine-Italian sculptor named Luciano Gabatti created a bronze statue that deliberately and directly inverted the composition of Cellini's own famous work, Standing in Florence, showing Medusa herself standing triumphant, sword lowered at her side, holding Perseus' own severed head aloft instead, a striking and deliberate reversal that received relatively little public attention at the time it was first created, but which found an entirely new audience and an entirely new resonance years later, Once a full-scale casting of that same statue was installed in public view in Manhattan, not far from a courthouse, arriving at almost exactly the same cultural moment a great many survivors of sexual assault were, for the very first time in generations, being publicly believed and publicly heard in numbers this whole modern world had never quite managed before, and it is worth sitting, honestly, with how strange and how fitting it actually is that a figure first given her monstrous shape by one entire strand of this ancient tradition as the direct and lasting consequence of an assault that was never her own fault should find herself, 3,000 years later, standing in a public square as a symbol, at last, of exactly the opposite thing, not a warning about what happens to women who are wronged, but a quiet, permanent monument to the possibility that the wronged might, someday, finally be the ones left standing. It is worth naming, too, one further and considerably more playful corner of Medusa's own modern afterlife, because the 20th and 21st centuries have hardly limited their own retelling of her story to serious scholarship and serious sculpture alone. Generations of moviegoers first met her, in many cases, not through any ancient text at all, but through a stop-motion film released in the early 1980s, in which a groundbreaking special effects artist brought her own snake-crowned form to life frame by painstaking frame for an audience of children and adults who had never read a single line of Hesiod or Ovid, and generations more recent still have met her again through a series of popular novels reimagining the whole of Greek mythology as a hidden, ongoing modern world, introducing an entirely new generation of young readers to her own name, her own family, and her own uneasy legacy long before any of them ever encountered an actual ancient source. It is worth pausing on what that continuous, restless reinvention actually tells us, because it means Medusa's own story has never once been allowed to settle into a single, finished shape across the whole of its own 3,000-year existence, reinterpreted by every single generation that inherited her, from the archaic vase painters who first gave her a running stride, to Ovid reimagining her as a wronged priestess, to a modern sculptor turning Cellini's own famous composition on its head, to children's entertainment finding in her still one of the most immediately compelling monsters the ancient world ever produced. Let us walk back once more through everything this long night has actually carried us across, the way we like to do in this room whenever a night's telling has ranged as widely and as far as tonight's has, because a story built across so many competing tellings and so many centuries of retelling can be easy to lose the thread of by the time its own ending finally arrives, and this particular story deserves to be held complete and whole, one last time before we let it go. We began at the very edge of the known world, in a cave ringed by the frozen proof of every mistake that had ever reached it, and we traced Medusa's own family backward from that cave all the way to the restless, ungoverned sea itself, born of Phorcys and Ceto alongside two immortal sisters, and a whole wider family of monsters and guardians. This tradition never lets sit comfortably at any Olympian council table. We heard, in Hesiod's own oldest surviving telling, that she was born exactly as monstrous as she died, marked apart from her own sisters only by the single, arbitrary fact of her own mortality. And we heard, in Ovid's own considerably later telling, an entirely different story. A beautiful priestess assaulted inside the very temple meant to keep her safest and transformed by the goddess whose sanctuary had been defiled into the very monster this whole tradition would go on to remember her as, a punishment this telling refused, across everything we have described tonight, to simply explain away. We followed Perseus from his own mother's bronze prison, and her own chest set adrift on the open sea, through a rash promise made in wounded pride, to a mountainside encounter with three blind and helpless sisters sharing a single stolen eye, and onward, at last, to that same cave at the edge of the world, where a sleeping woman was killed by a stranger she never harmed. guided by a mirror rather than by any direct sight of what he was actually doing, her own final children springing fully formed from the wound that ended her. We watched two immortal sisters wake to a grief that would never end, and a wailing so raw, an entire musical instrument was invented afterwards specifically to echo it. We watched her severed head cross an empty desert and leave an entire species of venomous serpent behind it, turn a weary titan into an actual mountain range, destroy a sea monster and a jealous, armed rival alike, and finally come to rest, permanently, at the centre of the very goddess's own shield, who may, in one whole strand of this story, have been responsible for what that head had become in the first place. We watched a chained princess become a wife, and, alongside her own parents and her own rescuer, an entire small constellation still visible tonight to anyone with a clear enough sky and enough patience to find it. And we watched an old prophecy finally, quietly fulfill itself, not through any ambition of Perseus's own, but through a single gust of wind and a discus thrown at a stranger's own funeral games, closing, at last, the very fear that had set this entire story into motion before Perseus himself had even been born. We traced this same story too, across every hand that ever actually carried it forward, from Homer naming her face on a hero's own shield without needing to explain why, to Hesiod placing her plainly within her own family tree, to Pindar giving her sister's own grief a musical form, to Ovid, centuries later, and in an entirely different language, giving her a beauty and a betrayal no earlier source had ever recorded, to a nameless Athenian vase painter capturing her court mid-stride, to the ordinary Greek families who carved her face above their own doorways and pressed it into their own coins and buried it, small and bone-carved, alongside their own dead. We set her beside Humbaba's own household plaques, and Bess's own squat guardian face, and we let those distant, uncertain echoes stand exactly as uncertain as they actually are. And we watched her cross, finally, into an entirely different age altogether, carved by Cellinian bronze, painted by Caravaggio onto a shield of his own, reduced by Freud to a theory and reclaimed by Sixus as a rallying cry, cast a second time by a sculptor who finally let her stand instead of fall, and stamped, whether anyone using it stops to remember her or not, onto a fashion house's own handbags and a doctor's own diagnosis, and a biologist's own careful Latin name for a creature drifting quietly through the sea she was born beside, what this whole long night was actually asking. We are nearly at the end of tonight's telling, and it is worth pausing before we let this story finally close to set Medusa beside the other great figures this channel has already spent long nights with in this very room, because the comparison tells us something true about what this particular story was actually built, to explore that none of those other tales quite manage in the same way. Heracles spent his whole life atoning for a single unbearable act that was never truly his fault. Achilles chased a glory that burned brighter for being brief. Odysseus survived through patience and cunning rather than strength. Zeus, in the story this channel told across an entire earlier night, spent 3 generations of his own family's history learning, slowly and imperfectly, how to hold power without becoming afraid of everyone who might one day take it from him. Every one of those stories, however much suffering runs through them, is ultimately a story told from inside the hero's own perspective, following a figure this tradition wants us in the end to admire. It is worth pausing too on the particular pairing this same single night story actually gives us, because Medusa was never the only woman endangered through no fault of her own across everything we have described tonight, and it is worth setting her directly beside Andromeda for a moment, because the two of them, held up together, tell us something this tradition rarely says plainly. Both women were made to suffer for a transgression that belonged to someone else entirely, Medusa for a god's own violence inside a temple that was never hers to defile, Andromeda for a mother's own careless boast about a beauty she had never once claimed for herself. Both were left chained, in the most literal sense for one, and in a considerably more metaphorical sense for the other, waiting for a fate neither of them had any power to prevent. And yet one of them was rescued, celebrated, married, and placed among the stars in a posture of gratitude, while the other was killed in her sleep and remembered, for 3,000 years afterward, primarily as a monster. And it is worth asking, honestly, what actually separated their two fates so completely. Because this telling does not believe the honest answer has very much to do with either woman's own character at all. It has considerably more to do with timing, with which side of the danger each one happened to be standing on, when Perseus finally arrived, one already transformed and irreversibly monstrous by the time he found her, the other still recognisably, conventionally beautiful and therefore still legible to a passing hero, as someone worth saving rather than someone to be feared. Medusa's story is not that kind of story at all, and it is worth sitting with that difference honestly, because for the whole of the version most widely remembered, she is never actually the hero of her own tale, never even reliably granted the interior life this tradition so freely gives to the men who acted upon her. First Poseidon, then Athena, then Perseus himself, each one making a choice about her own body and her own fate that she herself was never once asked about. It is a story, in the end, less about individual heroism than about the single question this whole tradition keeps circling back to whenever it finally gets around to examining its own women closely enough. Not what did she do to deserve this, because in the most honest telling this story allows she did nothing at all, but what does it actually cost a woman, across 3,000 years of retelling, to have her own worst day permanently mistaken by nearly everyone who hears about it afterward, for her entire character. It is worth pausing too on how closely this whole shape actually echoes a story this channel has already told in full, because this same tradition gave us, in the story of Zeus, an entirely different figure punished far beyond any reasonable measure for a transgression that was never fully his own fault to answer for alone. Prometheus, we may recall, was chained to a mountain and left to suffer an unending torment for the crime of giving humanity a gift the gods above him had simply refused to share freely, and it is worth setting his own long punishment beside Medusa's, because both figures were made to suffer disproportionately at the hands of an Olympian, whose own reasoning, whatever ancient religious logic may have justified it at the time, reads today as considerably harder to accept than the tradition itself ever seems willing to admit. It is worth naming too that both figures eventually found their own way into the modern world as symbols of exactly the opposite thing their own punishment was meant to represent. Prometheus remembered now as a byword for defiant, generous rebellion against unjust authority, and Medusa, across the same recent decades this telling has already described tonight, increasingly remembered not as a warning but as a survivor. Two ancient punishments that took nearly 3,000 years apiece to finally be read, by a wide and sympathetic audience, the way this telling suspects they may have always deserved to be read in the first place. It is worth noticing, too, one final asymmetry this whole story leaves us with, because it is the detail that makes any simple, comfortable reading of it impossible to sustain. Perseus faces no lasting consequence at all for the ambush he carried out against a sleeping woman, celebrated instead, across the whole of the following 3,000 years, as one of Greek mythology's great and admirable heroes. Poseidon faces no consequence whatsoever for the violence that set this entire chain of events into motion in the first place, continuing to rule the whole of the sea, entirely undiminished for the whole rest of this tradition's storytelling. And Athena, whichever telling of her own role you find more convincing, both made Medusa what she became and later wore her face forever as a badge of her own protection. Only Medusa herself carries any lasting cost across the whole of this story, first in the violence done to her, then in the transformation that followed it, and finally in the death that ended her, and it is worth sitting, honestly, in the discomfort of a story. This old and this widely retold never actually managing, across 3,000 years of careful and thoughtful audiences to balance that particular ledger even once, it is worth pausing one final time before we let this whole long night close on the particular word this telling has already returned to again and again tonight, monster, because it is worth naming plainly, here at the very end, exactly how much weight that single word has actually been asked to carry across everything we have described. A monster, in the plainest and oldest sense this tradition ever gave the word, was simply a warning made visible, a portent or a sign meant to be read and understood by whoever encountered it. And it is worth sitting with how much more honest that older meaning actually is than the flattened, purely villainous sense the word eventually settled into across the centuries since. Because Medusa, in nearly every telling this story has walked through tonight, was never simply a threat to be eliminated so much as a warning about something else entirely, about a god's own unchecked appetite, about a goddess's own misdirected anger, about how easily an entire civilization could look at a woman who had survived the worst thing that ever happened to her and decide, collectively and for 3,000 years running, that the safest thing to do with that survival was to carve her face onto a shield and never ask her, even once, what she herself might have wanted instead. That perhaps is the truest reason this particular story has outlasted every simplified retelling later ages layered on top of it. Because underneath the severed heads and the winged sandals and the field of frozen statues ringing a cave at the edge of the world, it is a story about a very old and very human question that has nothing to do with monsters or magic mirrors at all. Whether a person can ever really be separated, in the eyes of everyone who comes after them, from the single worst thing that was ever done to them, and whether the word monster, once it has been attached to someone by a poet or a goddess, or an entire tradition of retelling, can ever actually be taken back again. Medusa never got the chance to answer that question for herself, but it is worth carrying the question with you regardless, long after her own story has finally ended tonight, because it is, in the end, a far more honest inheritance than any severed head or any polished shield, and it may be the one thing this ancient story still has left to ask of anyone still listening, 3,000 years after it was first told. It is worth naming. One final time before we let this whole long night close, everyone who actually made this story what it turned out to be, because a monster, exactly like a king, is never really the whole of her own story, however completely later ages come to remember her that way. There was Keto, whose own restless seaborn line first carried this whole strange family into the world. There were Stheno and Euryale, two immortal sisters who woke to a grief with no natural end and no target left to answer it, and who are, this telling suspects, most likely still keeping watch over an empty cave at this very moment, tonight, while you listen. There were the three grey sisters of the Greya, who lost, however briefly, the single shared eye that let them see the world at all, simply because a young man needed directions and had no interest in asking politely. There was Danae, who survived a bronze prison and an open sea with her own infant son held close the entire way, and who spent years afterwards simply watching her own child grow, never once certain the old fear that had set her adrift was actually finished with either of them. There was Dictys, who drew a wooden chest out of the water expecting nothing, and received in return a lifetime's worth of quiet, unglamorous kindness, repaid many years later with an entire kingdom. There was Andromeda, chained to a rock for a boast that was never her own, who still found the courage to speak clearly to the stranger who came to free her. There were the countless, uncounted men frozen at the edge of that same cave, whose own names none of the old poets ever thought worth writing down. There was Hermes, who lent a blade and asked for nothing back beyond its own safe return. There was Athena, who made her and unmade her both, and who never, across the whole of this long story, had to choose only one of those two roles. And there was Medusa herself, guardian by name if never quite by fate, who did not ask to be born mortal among her own immortal sisters, did not ask for whatever happened to her in whichever version of this story you yourself find truest, and did not ask either to spend the last 3,000 years as the single most recognised face in the whole of Greek mythology. None of them are the name carved above the temple door. All of them are the reason there was ever a story worth telling about it at all. We have spent tonight with a whole family of the sea's own strangest children, a mortal daughter born into an immortal house, a hero who succeeded only by refusing to look directly at what he'd come to do, and a face that outlived every single person who ever told its story, carried forward now by nothing more than the patient, unbroken habit of one generation after another choosing to pass it on. There is no more sea to cross tonight, and no more cave left standing at the edge of a world this long story has already carried you all the way around. The wind has finally gone still over that empty stretch of desert sand. The last of Stheno and Euryale's own grieving cry has faded somewhere far behind us into pure silence, and a face that once turned the living to stone has, across 3,000 years of careful retelling, finally been allowed to simply rest. If you're still awake, you do not have to be. If tonight's long story carried you somewhere good, you're welcome to like the video and subscribe, and if you would like to, leave a thought down in the comments, and I will read it in the morning. But that is tomorrow's business, and it can wait. For now, let your body settle a little more heavily into the bed beneath you. Let your shoulders finally set down a weight they have been carrying all day without your even noticing. Let your breathing slow, all on its own, the way it wants to, and let the last echo of that ancient cave, the wind, the wings, the long, unbroken quiet of everything turned finally to stone, fade out gently behind you, the way it faded at last for one small, wronged, misunderstood face that grew, across a whole long night's telling, into something this tradition never quite managed to look at directly, not out of fear anymore, but out of something closer, at last, to understanding. Close your eyes, and let yours come now, too. Good night, and sweet dreams.